November 19th is simply when the bill arrives. Operation Uranus launches before dawn that morning with an artillery preparation that fires roughly 3,500 guns simultaneously along the attack frontages northwest and south of Stalingrad. The barrage lasts roughly 80 minutes. Soviet commanders later record that the ground shook continuously for the entire preparation period across a front stretching dozens of miles. Romanian soldiers occupying positions in the path of the assault, the 3rd Romanian Army to the north and the 4th Romanian Army to the south, have been flagging the buildup opposite them for weeks through intelligence reports that reach German Army Group B headquarters and fail to produce armored reserves positioned close enough to matter. The Romanian divisions hold the flanks because the German 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus has committed its strength into Stalingrad itself. By November 1942, Paulus has roughly 290,000 soldiers grinding through the city's factory district in fighting so compressed and violent that tactical gains are measured in individual buildings and floors rather than miles. Each city block requires clearing with grenades, submachine guns, and flamethrowers in combat that fractures divisions to company strength across weeks of continuous engagement. The 6th Army's logistical tail stretches back across the Don Steppe. Fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement soldiers arriving along supply lines that run through exactly the ground the Romanian armies are supposed to be holding. Now step back from the city itself and look at what Soviet planning has assembled outside it. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Colonel General Alexander Vasilevsky present Operation Uranus to Stalin in mid-September 1942, while the Stalingrad street fighting is still at its most violent. The plan requires accumulating attack forces on both flanks of the German salient simultaneously, without the German intelligence apparatus detecting the buildup's true scale. Soviet deception measures, concealing tank movements to nighttime, maintaining radio silence across assembling formations, positioning units behind terrain features that limit aerial reconnaissance effectiveness, successfully mask a force that eventually comprises roughly 1 million soldiers, more than 900 tanks, and approximately 13,000 artillery pieces across both attack groupings. The northern pincer concentrates against the 3rd Romanian Army. The Romanian formation holds roughly 100 kilometers of front, with divisions equipped with anti-tank guns, firing shells capable of penetrating roughly 30 millimeters of armor at combat range. Weapons adequate against light tanks, but structurally insufficient against Soviet T-34 tanks weighing 32 tons with frontal hull armor 47 millimeters thick. The Romanians have been requesting additional German anti-tank support and armored reserves for weeks. The requests produce promises rather than equipment. On the morning of November 19th, the Soviet 5th Tank Army and 21st Army collide with those Romanian positions behind an artillery barrage that erodes the defensive line within hours rather than days. Inside a T-34 moving through the breach, the driver navigates by the narrow forward vision slit, while the commander stands in the open turret hatch despite the cold, needing the wider visibility to direct movement through defensive positions that are collapsing faster than the advance can fully exploit. The tank's diesel engine produces 500 horsepower, and the vehicle moves at roughly 30 miles per hour across the frozen steppe. The temperature outside is already below -20 degrees Celsius. Frost collects on the exterior surfaces of the hull, while the engine heat keeps the interior just functional enough for the crew to operate. Soviet armored columns drive southwest through the gap the artillery has torn. The southern pincer opens on November 20th, one day later, when the Soviet 51st and 57th Armies strike the 4th Romanian Army southeast of Stalingrad. The southern Romanian force collapses under the same structural problem as the northern one. Infantry formations with inadequate anti-tank weapons facing Soviet armor in quantities their defensive positions were never resourced to absorb. The two pincers drive toward each other across the Don Steppe, aiming at the small Soviet town of Kalach on Don, roughly 60 miles west of Stalingrad. German armored reserves do exist in the area, the 14th Panzer Corps and elements of other formations, but they are positioned too far from the breakthrough points to close the gaps before Soviet armor pours through them. The response is recalibrated repeatedly across November 19th and 20th as the true scale of the Soviet offensive becomes clear to Army Group B headquarters. but each recalibration runs behind the pace of the Soviet advance. A panzer division that needs to cover 40 miles to reach a breach point and is burning fuel across frozen steppe roads while Soviet tanks are already 60 miles deep into what was the Romanian rear area is not closing a gap. It is chasing a situation that has already changed shape. On November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers meet at Kalach on Don. The encirclement closes around the German 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army, roughly 290,000 Axis soldiers inside a pocket whose perimeter stretches approximately 100 miles. The ring is not immediately impenetrable. German forces probe the encirclement in the first days and find it thinner in places than Soviet commanders want. But the speed with which Soviet armies consolidate the outer ring and push additional forces into blocking positions erodes the window where a breakout attempt might have succeeded against a perimeter not yet fully hardened. Paulus requests permission to break out. Hitler refuses. The decision to hold Stalingrad, rather than fight through the encirclement while the pocket is still relatively fresh, is one of the most examined command decisions of the entire Eastern Front. And the reasoning Hitler applies, that abandoning Stalingrad concedes the strategic objective of the entire summer campaign, that Göring has promised air supply can sustain the pocket, that a relief force will break through from outside, has a surface logic that collapses against operational reality within weeks. The air supply promise fails first and most completely, as documented in the daily tonnage figures that German logisticians record with a precision that makes the gap between requirement and delivery almost physically painful to trace across the weeks of the airlift. The pocket needs approximately 500 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat function. The Luftwaffe delivers a daily average of approximately 94 tons in December. The gap between those two numbers, 406 tons every single day, is the margin by which the 6th Army begins starving before the relief attempt even reaches its crisis point. Something I find consistently striking when working through the German operational documents from those weeks is the way the language in formal communications maintains a kind of professional steadiness that the underlying numbers completely contradict. Reports describe units as holding, defensive lines as stabilized, relief forces as making progress. The tonnage figures filed in the same documents by the same staffs tell a story of systematic collapse that the narrative language refuses to acknowledge directly. Operation Winter Storm, the relief attempt launched by Army Group Don under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein in December, closes to within roughly 48 kilometers of the pocket's southern edge before Soviet counterattacks and the attrition of the relief forces' armored strength erode the advance beyond recovery. The distance between the relief force and the encircled army becomes a number that does not shrink further regardless of what is committed to close it. The 6th Army's fate is settled by January 1943, even before the final Soviet compression of the pocket. Soldiers are on ration scales that produce starvation over weeks. Frostbite casualties accumulate in units without adequate winter clothing. Ammunition rationing forces artillery batteries to conserve shells that defensive combat requires firing continuously. Horses are slaughtered for food. Medical supplies run out in aid stations treating wounds that require surgical intervention the facilities can no longer provide. All of this traces directly back to the morning of November 19th, when Soviet artillery fired 3,500 guns along the Romanian flank positions, and the encirclement that Zhukov and Vasilevsky had been building for 2 months began closing around an army that Hitler had committed too deep into a city to extract in time. If you are somewhere quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes late enough that everything outside has gone still, think about what the Don steppe looks like in November at -20 degrees Celsius. Frozen grass, snow, and a Soviet T-34 moving at 30 miles per hour through a gap where a Romanian defensive line stood 6 hours ago. 290,000 German soldiers 60 miles to the east are still fighting in a city, still expecting relief, still receiving orders to hold. The encirclement is not complete yet. It will be in 4 days. This is the entire history of Operation Uranus, the trap that doomed Stalingrad during the Second World War. The map that wasn't burned. There's a particular kind of historical accident that doesn't announce itself as significant. It arrives in the archive as a footnote or a single line in a unit diary, or, in this case, as a routing stamp on a captured document that reads, in German bureaucratic formality, Nur für den Dienstgebrauch, for official use only. Not top secret, not eyes only, just official. The stamp matters because of what it was protecting, and because of what happened to that protection on June 19, 1942, somewhere over the Soviet steppe east of Kharkov. Major Joachim Reichel was the chief of operations for the 23rd Panzer Division. He was flying in a Fiesler Storch, a light liaison aircraft with a cruising speed of 130 kilometers per hour, on what should have been a routine inspection of the forward areas. He was carrying, in his briefcase, the operational annexes for Case Blue. Not a summary, not a briefing memo. The actual divisional attack orders, with axes of advance, timetables, unit designations, and maps. A November 1940 order from the OKH had explicitly forbidden classified material from being taken into forward areas. Reichel violated that order. His aircraft came down behind Soviet lines. A patrol of the 76th Rifle Division found the briefcase before Reichel could finish burning it. Within an hour, the contents were on their way up the chain of command. By the end of the day, the complete German operational plan for their entire 1942 southern offensive was sitting in front of Soviet intelligence officers. That's where the story should have changed. It didn't. Stalin received word of the find and dismissed it. His assessment, as reconstructed from Soviet internal records and Franz Halder's diary entries from late June, was that the documents were either forgeries or a deliberate German plant. He did nothing with them. Case Blue commenced on June 28th, on schedule. Hitler, furious at Reichel's breach, sacked several officers and spent an anxious several days wondering whether the Soviets had the plans. But he didn't cancel the offensive either. Both sides received a gift, and both sides refused to open it. There is something almost philosophical about that symmetry, if you're in the mood to find philosophy in military catastrophe. I'm not sure I am. What I find more useful is to follow the institutional logic on both sides. Stalin, in mid-1942, was operating from a model of German intentions that had already survived one catastrophic falsification, the June 1941 invasion, which he had also dismissed as a provocation. His methodology for processing unwelcome intelligence had already proven itself lethal once. The Reichel documents didn't fit his model. His model, therefore, rejected them. On the German side, the willingness to proceed with Case Blue despite the security breach tells you something equally important. The offensive was already under enough political and operational momentum that the discovery of a breach, even a potentially catastrophic one, couldn't interrupt it. Halder's diary for July 23rd is stark. He describes what he calls a chronic tendency to underestimate enemy capabilities, and notes it's assuming grotesque proportions. He's writing about Hitler. He's also, without knowing it, writing about himself, and about an institutional culture that was already generating its own blindness. Case Blue, once it launched, ran with the terrifying speed that had characterized German armored operations since 1940. By mid-July, Hitler made the decision that every subsequent analysis of Stalingrad treats as the original sin of German strategy in the East. He split Army Group South into Army Groups A and B and assigned them simultaneous objectives in the Caucasus and at Stalingrad. The logic, such as it was, held that Soviet resistance was crumbling, that the army had the momentum to pursue both, and that the oil fields at Baku and the city on the Volga could be taken at the same time by a force already stretched across a front of 480 kilometers. General Halder didn't believe it. He said so. In September, he was dismissed. His replacement was Kurt Zeitzler, who was younger, more compliant, and would not obstruct. The removal of the person most likely to say no to the plan that was killing the plan is itself a kind of operational event, and it's one that almost never appears on the order of battle summaries. The 6th Army reached the Volga north of Stalingrad on August 23rd. The battle for the city began the same day, when 6th Army vanguards penetrated the suburbs. Simultaneously, the vast stretches of the Don River bend that formed the 6th Army's left flank and the 4th Romanian Army's extended front south of the city began to be occupied by the Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces that Hitler had called upon as allies. The 3rd Romanian Army took a defensive line of roughly 90 miles along the Don. The 4th Romanian Army was assigned a front of approximately 170 miles south of Stalingrad. These frontages were not theoretical problems, they were arithmetic ones. A force assigned 170 miles of front with the equipment available to the 4th Romanian Army in autumn 1942 cannot hold it against a determined adversary. The arithmetic was known, documented, and ignored. That document, the one that should have generated alarm, is not a dramatic battlefield intercept. It's a supply requisition form. And in some ways, it's a more damning record than anything found in Reichel's briefcase. The satellite armies, men sent to die on paper. The Romanian National Military Archives in Bucharest hold supply ledger records from the 3rd Romanian Army's autumn 1942 period. I want to be honest about the limits of my access here. I'm working from photographs of these documents as they appear in secondary literature, and from references in Jonathan Trigg's Death on the Don, which drew on Romanian language sources unavailable to most Western historians. But the ledgers themselves are specific enough to be worth dwelling on. In the margin of one requisition page, next to a line item requesting 47mm anti-tank ammunition, someone wrote in Romanian, "Nemci nu au dat nimic." The Germans gave nothing. The entry is stamped, "Deferred, pending German allocation." The allocation never came. I've read a great deal of archival marginalia in the course of this work. That phrase, 4 words, written in a supply ledger, stays with me more than most of what appears in the more celebrated documents. The military mathematics of the 3rd Romanian Army's position in autumn 1942 are not complicated, but they require spelling out because they're usually elided in favor of narrative. General Dumitrescu's army held a front of approximately 140 kilometers along the Don Bend with 2 cavalry and 8 infantry divisions. Against this, the Soviets would eventually position the 5th Tank Army, the 21st Army, and the 65th Army for the northern pincer of Operation Uranus, forces totaling, in the breakthrough sectors, an artillery density approaching 8 guns for every 1 Romanian gun. Each Romanian infantry division had received, by October 1942, exactly 6 75mm PaK 97-38 anti-tank guns. 6 per division. These were modified French First World War field guns fitted with a high-velocity barrel as an expedient anti-tank measure. They were the only weapons in the Romanian inventory with any prospect of penetrating Soviet armor at combat range. 6 per division across a 140-kilometer front. The document showing Romania had formally requested 3,756 units of the 75mm PaK 40, the actual effective German anti-tank gun, and received almost none, is available in post-war Romanian military records. The gap between what was requested and what was delivered is not a logistical footnote. It's the operational result of the battle, written in advance. The situation of the 22nd Panzer Division deserves particular attention because it's both darkly comic and structurally essential to understanding what happened on November 19th. The 22nd Panzer was the armored nucleus of General Ferdinand Heim's 48th Panzer Corps, the mobile reserve positioned behind the Romanian Third Army to respond to precisely the kind of Soviet breakthrough that was being planned. In the weeks before the offensive, field mice sheltering from the autumn cold had worked their way into the division's bivouacked tanks and armored vehicles. They gnawed through rubber-insulated electrical wiring and fuel lines. The 22nd Panzer's maintenance logs, cited by Antony Beevor in Stalingrad, drawing on German unit records, document an abnormal rate of electrical system failures in the period immediately before November 19th. When Heim's Corps was finally ordered to advance against the Soviet breakthrough, it entered battle with approximately 30 combat-ready tanks in the 22nd Panzer. Not 30 per regiment, 30 in the entire division. The armored reserve behind 140 kilometers of Romanian front had the combat power of a reinforced company. There's a temptation, reading the post-war German accounts, to frame the Romanian and Italian collapse as a failure of willpower or fighting quality. Erich von Manstein's memoir, Lost Victories, has a version of this argument. I don't find it credible, and I want to be specific about why. The Romanian anti-tank weapon that formed the primary defense against Soviet armor was the 37mm Bowler pattern gun, a weapon firing at a muzzle velocity of approximately 762 meters per second. Against the frontal armor of a T-34, 45 millimeters of steel sloped at 60 degrees, producing an effective protection equivalent of roughly 90 millimeters, this gun could achieve nothing at any realistic combat range. Romanian crews who held their positions and fired these weapons at approaching Soviet tanks in November 1942 weren't displaying inadequate willpower. They were performing an act that required something closer to the opposite. The supply ledgers tell you what the German High Command knew about the Romanian anti-tank capability. Manstein's memoir tells you what the German High Command later wanted to remember about it. These are not the same document. The relationship between the Romanian and Hungarian forces on the flanks is a detail that disappears almost entirely from the English-language histories of Uranus, and its absence distorts the picture. These two allied armies could not be stationed adjacent to each other. Age-old ethnic and territorial disputes, specifically the ongoing conflict over Transylvania, which had been partially awarded to Hungary by German arbitration in 1940, meant that Romanian and Hungarian units required an Italian buffer zone between them on the Don front. The Italian Eighth Army wasn't positioned where it was because of pure operational logic. It was positioned there because a 19th-century ethnic rivalry made any other arrangement potentially explosive. This affected the physical layout of the entire Axis defensive line, including the specific location of the seam between formations, seams that Soviet planners identified as breakthrough points. The hatred between nominal allies shaped the geography of the disaster. By November 1942, the letters coming from Italian soldiers on the Don had a particular quality. One sergeant in the Cossaria division wrote to his family describing their anti-tank weapons as toys against Russian iron. I'm not going to attribute invented thoughts to him, but the description he chose, toys against iron, is a precise military assessment as much as it is a complaint. The letter is in Italian, and I've worked from a translation in secondary sources that I can't verify word for word, so I cite it with appropriate caution. But the material facts he was describing, the Cossaria Division's primary anti-tank capability in autumn 1942 consisted largely of the 47mm Bowler gun, firing essentially the same caliber and velocity as the Romanian weapon, are documented independently. He wasn't exaggerating, he was being accurate. The 48th Panzer Corps mice story tends to get told as a curiosity, and I understand why. It has an absurdist quality that makes it memorable in a way that supply deficit tables don't. But I think the emphasis is slightly wrong. The mice didn't cause the German failure on the flanks. They were one additional increment of degradation applied to a formation that was already structurally a fiction. A Panzer Corps with 30 serviceable tanks isn't a mobile reserve. Calling it one, in operational orders, in situation reports, in Hitler's daily briefings, was a form of institutional self-deception that the German command had been practicing since at least July. The mice just made it visible in a way the paperwork had concealed. What the supply ledgers, the requisition denials, the anti-tank caliber tables, and the maintenance logs collectively describe is an abandonment that preceded any Soviet action. The Axis flank armies weren't simply weak. They were deployed to a defensive task they couldn't perform with the tools they were given. And the German formations that were supposed to compensate for that weakness were themselves degraded to the point of irrelevance. All of this was documented. The paper trail exists. When I encounter the framing, still common in popular histories, that suggests Uranus succeeded because of Soviet skill alone, I want to redirect attention to those Romanian requisition forms. The Germans had filed the paperwork on their own defeat long before November. The architects, two men in a room with a map. The night of September 12th to 13th, 1942, the meeting in the Kremlin where Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky first sketched the operational concept that would become Uranus comes to us primarily through Zhukov's post-war memoir, Marshal of Victory. This creates a problem that I want to name directly rather than paper over. Zhukov's memoir is a document produced by a man with a significant stake in how history remembered him, published in a Soviet Union that controlled what could and couldn't be said about the war's conduct. It's shaped evidence. That doesn't make it useless. Shaped evidence is still evidence, but it means reading it requires a kind of lateral attention, watching not just what it says, but what it conspicuously doesn't say. What Zhukov describes is a scene with the quality of a well-lit theatrical moment. He and Vasilevsky step away from a briefing with Stalin and speak quietly in an anteroom, studying the situation maps of the Stalingrad front. Stalin approaches unseen and asks what they're thinking about so deeply. Zhukov explains the concept: a double envelopment, striking the weak Romanian flanks rather than the German positions in the city, driving deep to link up near the town of Kalach on the Don. Stalin says, reportedly, "Think about it more. Don't talk to anyone about it. The scene is too well shaped for me to accept entirely on its own terms." What I can verify is that a Soviet operational planning document from this period bears what subsequent Soviet officials described as a handwritten annotation in Stalin's distinctive red pencil script. The word was "so." One word. In the grammar of Stalinist authority, that one word authorized one of the largest encirclement operations in military history. The division of credit between Zhukov and Vasilevsky is a genuine historiographical dispute, and it's worth being specific about what each post-war account claims. Zhukov's account places the conceptual breakthrough, the insight that the Romanian flanks, not the German city defenses, were the target, as principally his own. Vasilevsky's memoir attributes the idea as jointly conceived. Soviet official histories, written under institutional pressure to present the Stavka collective rather than individual genius, distribute credit broadly. David Glantz's operational analysis, which had access to declassified Soviet planning documents in the 1990s, suggests the core operational insight almost certainly came from Zhukov, whose pattern recognition from the Khalkhin Gol encirclement in 1939 was likely directly relevant. But the feasibility analysis, the actual calculation of whether the forces were sufficient, whether the logistics could support the advance rates required, whether the deception operation could conceal the buildup, that was overwhelmingly Vasilevsky's work. The elegant concept is Zhukov's. The plan that could actually be executed is Vasilevsky's. History gave the first man the larger monument, which is probably fair in terms of operational vision and somewhat unfair in terms of operational reality. The deception operation, Maskirovka, that concealed the Uranus buildup is one of the more extraordinary logistics achievements of the entire war, and it tends to get summarized in ways that understate its technical complexity. The Soviets moved approximately 1,100,000 personnel, 894 tanks, and 13,451 artillery pieces into position without being detected by German aerial reconnaissance or signals intelligence. The method was specific. New units arriving at the front maintained absolute radio silence and communicated only by courier. Forward units that had been in position for weeks maintained their normal radio traffic patterns and call signs, giving German signals intelligence a picture of normal activity. Fake bridges were erected on the Don to draw reconnaissance photography away from the real bridges being constructed at night. Troop movements happened only in fog, snowfall, or after dark. In 3 weeks, approximately 111,000 soldiers, 420 tanks, and 556 artillery pieces were ferried across the Volga under intermittent German artillery fire. Zhukov's multiple trips to the front during October and November tell you something important about how Soviet command culture was changing. He visited Serafimovich, where he met with Rokossovsky and Vatutin to discuss the northern arm of the Pincer. He traveled to the headquarters of General Tolbukin's 57th Army south of Stalingrad. He met with commanders at every level of the attack force, incorporating their assessments of local conditions into the planning process while never revealing to any of them the full scope of the operation. Front and Army commanders were given their individual objectives without being told they were part of a double envelopment aimed at encircling the entire Sixth Army. The word encirclement was deliberately withheld from most of the participating troops until the final hours. This compartmentalization was unprecedented in Red Army practice, and its success was not accidental. It represented a specific institutional lesson drawn from the security failures of the early war years. The German intelligence organization responsible for assessing Soviet capabilities was Fremde Heeres Ost, Foreign Armies East, under General Oberst Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen's service detected elements of the buildup. Aerial reconnaissance photographed increased Soviet activity in the Serafimovich sector. Unit identifications in the Rzhev area, the Army Group Center sector, showed new Soviet formations. What Gehlen's assessment concluded from this was that the main Soviet offensive capability was concentrated against Army Group Center to the north, and that the southern sector faced only local counterattack capacity. The specific mechanism of this failure matters. The Soviets had generated a false pattern by increasing troop movements near Moscow and setting up dummy formations in the Army Group Center sector, knowing that German intelligence would find the evidence and draw the intended conclusion. Gehlen's organization was defeated not by lack of data, but by data it was given specifically to misread. The deception was sophisticated enough to use the Germans' own analytical methodology against them. The three postponements of Operation Uranus receive very little space in Zhukov's memoir, which I find telling. The original launch date of November 9th was pushed back when Zhukov's front visits revealed that transportation delays had left many units still en route to their start positions. It was moved to November 17th. It was then postponed again when Zhukov was told the air units allocated to the operation weren't ready. It finally launched on November 19th. Each postponement extended the window during which the buildup might be detected, and each postponement was a moment when the entire operation could have unraveled, not from Soviet decision, but from the cumulative weight of logistical reality pressing against operational ambition. Zhukov, to his credit, was willing to delay rather than launch prematurely. But his memoir's near silence on these close calls is the silence of a man managing a historical record rather than accounting for one. What I keep returning to when I think about the planning phase is the specificity of the geographic opportunity. The Soviet bridgeheads at Serafimovich and Kletskaya on the western bank of the Don, the positions from which the northern pincer of Uranus would launch, had been seized and held through brutal fighting in the summer of 1942, at enormous cost in lives, by Soviet forces who had no idea they were creating the launch platform for the war's most significant encirclement. The men who bled to hold those bridgeheads didn't know why they were holding them. That's almost always the condition of the soldier in any large operation, acting within a frame they can't see. But in this case, the gap between the local experience and the strategic meaning feels particularly sharp. The bridgeheads were the prerequisite, and the prerequisite was paid for without the payers knowing the price. The arithmetic of despair. Chuikov's rats hold the line. The 62nd Army's War Diary for October 14, 1942, is a document that rewards close reading. Between an urgent artillery support request and a unit positioning report, there's a logistics entry. Ammunition resupply, 47 rounds per gun remaining, 120 mm mortar shells critical, request 40 tons minimum by 1800 hours. 3 lines later, a casualty figure, 700 men lost before noon. I want to sit with the juxtaposition for a moment, not for dramatic effect, because the proximity of those two entries, the tonnage and the bodies, in the same handwriting on the same page, describes the actual texture of what happened in Stalingrad in ways that battle maps can't. The War Diary is a record of simultaneity, supply and death occurring at the same administrative speed. October 14th was, by most accounts, the worst single day of the battle for the city. The German Sixth Army launched what it considered its definitive assault, 3 divisions converging on the tractor factory district with the explicit aim of reaching the Volga and splitting Chuikov's 62nd Army in two. In significant respects, the assault succeeded. German forward units reached the Volga bank in the factory district. The 62nd Army was, for a period on that day, functionally divided, with communication broken between several regiments and headquarters. Chuikov's memoir, The Battle for Stalingrad, describes him as never having doubted the line would hold. I've read the German 6th Army after-action reports for October 14th, and I don't fully believe the retrospective certainty. That's not a judgment of Chuikov's courage, which is well documented. It's an observation about what memoirs do to lived experience. The decision that kept Stalingrad alive, and by extension made Operation Uranus viable, was one of the coldest pieces of strategic calculation in the war. Zhukov and Vasilevsky's policy was deliberate minimal reinforcement, feeding the 62nd Army just enough to prevent the city from falling, while systematically hoarding the strike force for Uranus. Chuikov made repeated urgent requests for additional resources throughout October. He received consistently less than he asked for. The Stavka's underdelivery wasn't logistical failure, it was a calculation. The men being fed into Stalingrad in dribs and drabs were, in a precise operational sense, being spent to protect a larger investment. Chuikov learned this only after the war. His reaction, recorded in post-war interviews, was reportedly something more complex than gratitude. The engineering battalions that maintain the Volga crossing deserve more historical attention than they receive. 38 engineer battalions were allocated to the Stalingrad front, responsible not just for the physical crossings, but for ferrying ammunition, personnel, and tanks across a river approximately 1.2 to 1.5 kilometers wide under intermittent German artillery and air attack. In 3 weeks during the Uranus preparation period, they transported approximately 111,000 soldiers, 420 tanks, and 556 artillery pieces across the Volga. This was the same organization that was simultaneously keeping Chuikov's army alive. The engineering units were running 2 operations at once, the defensive supply line and the offensive buildup, using the same boats, the same crossing points, the same men. The Volga crossing at Stalingrad was defended from German observation, partly by the river itself during periods of low light, and partly by the sheer difficulty of precision fire at moving targets at night. A German 88mm flak gun firing at a moving barge at 800 meters in direct fire mode had a probability of hit per round of roughly 15 to 20% under good conditions. That's a low number for catastrophic consequences. Engineering unit war diaries, cited in secondary sources, record boat crew casualties running at approximately 8 to 12% per week through the worst periods. Every crew member who climbed into a boat knew these numbers, more or less, in the intuitive way that people under fire come to understand their survival odds. They crossed anyway. Not because the numbers were reassuring, but because there was no alternative framing available to them. By mid-November, Chuikov's 62nd Army held a strip of rubble along the Volga bank, averaging perhaps 1,000 meters in depth and covering a front of roughly 30 kilometers. Some units were counted in dozens rather than hundreds. The army existed, physically, in the ruins of an industrial city, fighting room by room in conditions that stripped every tactical doctrine back to its most basic elements. What this created, strategically, was a situation in which 6 German divisions, including the 16th and 24th Panzer Divisions, were locked inside Stalingrad, fighting for buildings and factory floors, unable to be redeployed to the flanks regardless of what happened there. Chuikov's army wasn't just holding the city, it was holding the panzer divisions inside it. The strategic logic is almost geometric. The narrower the strip of urban ruin the 62nd Army held, the more German armored strength was committed to the attritional city fight, and the weaker the flanks became. 6 panzer and motorized divisions fighting for a kilometer of factory floor were 6 divisions not available to counter the Soviet armored thrust that was coming from 200 kilometers away. The November 11th German assault in the city came within 500 meters of Chuikov's headquarters, a concrete bunker dug into the Volga embankment. Chuikov didn't move. The position held, by accounts reconstructed from both Soviet and German unit reports, by margins measured in individual buildings. I'm not going to aestheticize this. What I'll say instead is that the operational significance of those 500 meters is measurable. If Chuikov's headquarters had fallen, command coherence in the 62nd Army might have collapsed, and the Army's ability to continue pinning German forces in the city would have been degraded at exactly the moment when Uranus was completing its final preparation. The Volga, in early November, was in what engineers call the impossible season, beginning to freeze, but with ice too thin for tank traffic and too thick for efficient boat operations. The engineering battalions adapted by maintaining a rotating fleet of motorboats, barges, and, as the ice thickened, sleds dragged by hand across the surface. The crossing never stopped. There's a Soviet photograph from this period that's sometimes reproduced in histories of Stalingrad, showing a group of men pushing a field gun across thin ice at night. The photograph is undated, the unit unidentified, but the physical reality it documents, the specific problem of moving heavy weapons across a freezing river in darkness, represents hundreds of similar moments that aren't photographed at all. The operational supply line that kept the 62nd Army alive was maintained by accumulated acts of this kind, performed in conditions that made every crossing a non-trivial risk. What strikes me, looking at the 62nd Army's situation in mid-November, is the degree to which the entire Uranus operation depended on something that couldn't be guaranteed, that the city would hold long enough. If the German assault of October 14th had succeeded in splitting the 62nd Army permanently, if the November 11th drive had reached the Volga embankment and captured Chuikov's headquarters, if the supply lines had broken under the combined pressure of artillery and ice, Uranus's assembly would have been meaningless. The offensive buildup was happening at the same time as the city was fighting for its existence, and the two processes were not independent of each other. The bridgeheads were the geographic foundation of Uranus. The 62nd Army was its temporal foundation. You needed both. The letter that almost stopped everything. On November 17, 1942, 48 hours before H hour, with the Uranus strike forces finally in position after 3 postponements and weeks of covert movement, General Vasily Volsky, commander of the 4th Mechanized Corps, wrote a letter to Stalin. The letter's full text has not, as of the time of this recording, been released in any publicly accessible archive. What we know of its contents comes primarily from John Ericsson's The Road to Stalingrad, which drew on Soviet internal records, and from Antony Beever's account in Stalingrad. Volsky wrote that the offensive as planned was doomed to failure given the state of the forces assigned to it. He recommended postponing and redesigning the operation entirely. This letter, written 2 days before one of the most consequential Soviet military operations of the war, is one of the most remarkable documents in the entire archive of Uranus. Not because it was prescient, but because it was both right and wrong at the same time, and the way it was both right and wrong tells you almost everything you need to know about military planning under authoritarian command. Volsky's corps was, on November 17th, not fully concentrated. Units were still arriving. Fuel was short. Many of his soldiers hadn't been issued winter clothing, and some had already developed frostbite. A contemporary political officer's report cited by Beaver states that soldiers died of frostbite due to the irresponsible attitude of commanders. Volsky's tanks faced the specific cold start problem that made pre-battle preparation a multi-hour process. The V2 diesel engine powering the T-34 had an optimal operating range beginning at -10 degrees Celsius, and below -20 degrees, the battery electric start became unreliable, requiring either external heating equipment or manual cranking. With the 4th Mechanized Corps fielding hundreds of tanks in temperatures that were dropping well below zero, the pre-battle preparation requirement alone was measured in hours that the timetable didn't contain. Volsky wasn't panicking. He was making a logistical assessment. The assessment was accurate. On November 17th, Vasilevsky was recalled to Moscow and shown the letter. His own account, written years later, acknowledges that he wanted to call off the offensive. He was overruled. The Stavka, specifically Stalin, made the decision to proceed. Stalin picked up the telephone and called Volsky directly, an act almost without precedent for a corps-level commander. The conversation, as reconstructed from post-war accounts, was essentially, "Will you carry out the operation if ordered to?" Volsky said yes. The offensive proceeded. The Soviet official history, published in 1961, Samsonov's Stalingrad, omits the Volsky letter episode entirely. Ericsson's Western account, using archive access unavailable to Samsonov, includes it in detail. The contrast between those two texts is a small, compressed history of how the Soviet Union managed its own military record. What happened on November 20th, when Volsky's corps finally attacked, late, with units intermixed, hours behind schedule, is the part of this story that resists the clean analytical framework. Volsky's corps advanced in disorder. Its units arrived in the wrong sequence. Coordination with the 51st Army broke down in the fog. General Popov, the Stalingrad front's deputy commander, had to drive to Volsky's headquarters personally to confront him about the delay. The 4th Mechanized Corps attacked in the late afternoon of November 20th, rather than at 10 in the morning as planned, and it broke through. The Romanian resistance in its sector had already been sufficiently degraded by earlier Soviet pressure that Volsky's disorganized, late, fuel-short corps was able to achieve the breakthrough the plan required. This is the uncomfortable part. The man who wrote that the operation was doomed was right about the problems. He was wrong about the conclusion. And the question of whether we should credit the plan or the circumstances for the outcome is not as clean as victory narratives suggest. The T-34's cold weather preparation requirement is worth explaining in the specific because it bears directly on Volsky's November 17th assessment. The Red Army developed a standard preheat protocol using a small blowtorch device inserted into the engine compartment. The procedure took approximately 20 to 30 minutes per tank at temperatures below -25 degrees Celsius. The 4th Mechanized Corps, in mid-November staging areas south of Stalingrad, was operating in temperatures that had already fallen below that threshold on several nights. With the Corps fielding several hundred tanks, the pre-battle engine preparation requirement, if done by the book, would have taken a significant fraction of the available night hours just to make the vehicles startable. Commanders were, by all accounts, cutting the procedure short. Some tanks were starting cold and taking the mechanical risk. Others weren't starting at all. When Volsky wrote that his forces weren't ready, he wasn't describing a morale problem or a leadership failure. He was describing a physics problem. Stalin's decision not to punish Volsky and his reported post-war characterization of the episode as an example of desirable upward communication is a piece of evidence I hold at arm's length. Stalin's track record with officers who delivered unwelcome assessments did not, in most cases, produce the outcome Volsky received. The more parsimonious explanation is that Volsky's corps performed well enough in the actual battle that retrospective punishment would have been awkward, and that Stalin's framing of the episode as a positive example of honesty was itself a piece of narrative management. I could be wrong about this. The full record of how Stalin processed the Volsky letter isn't public, but the story of a totalitarian leader warmly encouraging the subordinate who questioned him, filed alongside the institutional record of what typically happened to people who questioned him, requires some skepticism. What the Volsky letter opens up, beyond its specific content, is the question of how many other Soviet commanders in November 1942 shared his assessment and didn't write. The letter is anomalous not because Volsky was uniquely perceptive, but because he chose, in a system that punished honesty, to be honest. The silence of everyone else isn't evidence that everyone else was confident. It's evidence of a command culture in which the cost of dissent was high enough to suppress it. Volsky broke that calculation. He did so, apparently, because his assessment of the operational risk outweighed his assessment of the personal risk. That's not a small thing in the context of the Soviet military system in 1942. The final element of the Volsky episode that I find analytically important is the gap between the problem he identified and the cause of the eventual success. Volsky said, "My corps isn't ready. The plan is too risky. We should postpone." Stalin said, "Proceed." The corps proceeded, badly, and succeeded anyway, not because Volsky was wrong about the corps' readiness, but because the Romanian opposition collapsed faster than any planning assumption had anticipated. The success was real. The cause of the success was partly different from what the plan had assumed. This is not unusual in military operations, but it means that the lesson drawn from Uranus's success, that proceeding over Volsky's objections was the right call, is only valid if you accept that the outcome validates the decision. And outcomes don't always do that. Sometimes you're lucky and right. Sometimes you're lucky and wrong. The historical record at Stalingrad doesn't always allow you to tell the difference. The iron arithmetic, T-34 versus everything. There's a report from the Ural tank factory at Nizhny Tagil, dated October 1942, that I find clarifying in a way that battlefield accounts rarely are. The relevant line reads, T-34 production this month, 1,223 units. Rejected for quality defects, 47 units. Net delivery to the Red Army, 1,176 units. Against this, a Romanian 1st Armored Division combat strength return from approximately November 15th states operational R2 tanks at approximately 100 units. I've worked from secondary sources for both documents, so I'll be clear about that limitation. But the production figures are broadly consistent with multiple independent historical accounts of Soviet tank output in 1942, and the Romanian armored strength return is cited in Bivor and in Glance. The juxtaposition doesn't need elaboration. It needs only to be stated plainly. One factory, 1 month, 1,176 tanks. One Romanian armored division, approximately 100 operational vehicles of an entirely different class. The strategic arithmetic was written in steel before anyone drove to the front. The Romanian 1st Armored Division's primary equipment was the Czech-designed LTVZ-35, which the Romanians designated the R2. It mounted a 37mm Skoda A7 gun with a muzzle velocity of approximately 675 meters per second. The T-34's frontal hull plate was 45mm thick, sloped at 60 degrees from the vertical. The effective armor resistance against a non-penetrating projectile from a slope of that angle follows from basic trigonometry. If you divide the physical thickness by the cosine of the angle, you get the effective protection. 45 millimeters divided by the cosine of 60 degrees, which is 0.5, gives 90 millimeters. The R2's gun could not penetrate this at any combat range. The Romanian gun crews who held their positions and fired at approaching T-34s in November 1942 were doing so in the full knowledge, or at least the full physical experience, that their shells weren't stopping the vehicles. What they were doing was not tactically effective. I'm not going to assign a word to what it was otherwise. The 48th Panzer Corps, the German reserve behind the Romanian Third Army, is a more complex case than the Romanians, because it had, in theory, the 22nd Panzer Division. The 22nd Panzer in November 1942 was fielding the Panzer III and Panzer IV, vehicles with genuine capability against the T-34 under the right conditions. The problem wasn't the quality of the equipment that existed, it was the quantity. The 22nd Panzer entered November with fewer than 30 combat-ready tanks, down from a nominal strength of approximately 200 due to mechanical attrition, combat losses, and, as the maintenance logs record, the electrical system failures from rodent damage in the bivouac areas. A panzer division with 30 tanks facing a Soviet tank army with more than 400 isn't a force multiplier, it's a force denominator. The production asymmetry between Soviet and German armor in 1942 is a number that I want to state carefully, because it's sometimes cited in ways that flatten important distinctions. Soviet T-34 production in 1942 totaled approximately 12,553 units. German Panzer IV production, the only German tank with a gun capable of engaging T-34s with reliable effect at standard combat ranges, was approximately 994 units for the same year. The ratio is roughly 12.6 to 1. This number should not be read as meaning Soviet tanks were 12 times better, or that individual Soviet crews were 12 times more capable. They weren't. Soviet tank crew training in 1942 averaged as few as 72 hours, a figure that appears in Soviet training records as the minimum standard, and which was frequently not met. German crews received significantly more training. The T-34's transmission was so difficult to operate, requiring a driver of exceptional physical strength and skill to engage gears that weren't synchronized, that Soviet drivers routinely filed down selector fork edges on their own initiative to make shifting possible, a modification that shortened component life. After-action reports from Uranus described T-34s abandoned on the steppe not because they'd been hit, but because gears had seized, engines had failed, or crews had run out of fuel. The decision to power the T-34 with a diesel engine, rather than the petrol engines common in most 1939 and 1940 tank designs, was not accidental. It was an evidence-based engineering choice made in the 1930s, informed partly by a Soviet study of fire casualty rates in Spanish Civil War tank battles. Petrol-engine tanks, when penetrated or sufficiently damaged, had dramatically higher fire rates than diesel-engined equivalents. The V2 diesel engine, derived from aircraft engine technology and first installed in the T-34 prototype, was adopted partly because it reduced the probability of catastrophic fire after penetration. This decision, made approximately 6 years before Uranus, directly affected Soviet tank crew survival rates in the battle. The engineering logic was sound, the lead time was extraordinary, and the benefit was measurable in the proportion of T-34 crews who survived being hit versus the proportion of their opponents who did the same. The specific failure mode of Heim's 48th Panzer Corps on November 19th deserves reconstruction in some detail because it's usually compressed into a single paragraph in general histories. Heim received his initial orders to advance toward Kletskaya to support the Romanian defenses. He put his units on the road. At 11:30, new orders arrived from Hitler's headquarters, contradicting the previous orders, directing him to turn his forces northwest toward Bolshoi instead to intercept Soviet armored units. The direction change required reforming the attack column on icy roads with vehicles that were already burning irreplaceable fuel. By the time Heim's corps engaged Soviet forces near the Chir River at Peschani, the 22nd Panzer had approximately 20 functional tanks. The engagement was, by German accounts, brief, violent, and ultimately hopeless. Heim was subsequently recalled to Berlin, stripped of his rank, and imprisoned. He was released 10 months later without being tried. His rank was restored in August 1944. The Wehrmacht's treatment of Heim encapsulates something about how the German command processed institutional failure. The man blamed for the Corps' defeat was the same man whose corps had been deployed in a condition that made defeat inevitable. The production numbers for German tank output in 1942 weren't unknown to the German command. The gap between nominal panzer strength and actual operational readiness was documented in weekly reports that flowed through the OKH. What those documents collectively showed, and what the strategic planning continued to ignore, was that Germany was attempting to hold a front that required a different industrial base than the one it possessed. This is not a criticism that required post-war hindsight. It was available in the production figures in real time. The industrial arithmetic that decided Operation Uranus wasn't made in November 1942. It was made in the armaments ministries and factory floors of 2 countries across the preceding 3 years. And the 1942 production numbers are just the point where the arithmetic became impossible to avoid meeting in the field. H-hour, the code word siren. At 5 minutes past 5 in the morning on November 19, 1942, a German liaison officer named Lieutenant Gerhard Stock placed a telephone call from the Romanian 4th Army Corps sector near Kletskaya to 6th Army headquarters at Golubinsky. He had intelligence of an imminent Soviet attack. The duty officer who answered the call, aware that false alarms had become almost routine along the Romanian front over the preceding weeks, decided not to wake General Arthur Schmidt, the 6th Army's Chief of Staff. The call had come in after 5 o'clock, and the standing guidance was that false alarms were common at this hour. Stuck's warning was logged and not acted upon. 2 hours and 15 minutes later, the Soviet artillery commanders across the breakthrough sectors received the code word Siren, and the earth between the Don and the Volga began to move in ways it hadn't moved before. I've spent considerable time with the question of what Stuck actually knew and when he knew it, because the phone call sits at an unusual intersection of intelligence accuracy and institutional failure. He was right that an attack was coming. He was roughly 2 hours early on the timing. The bombardment began at 7:20 Moscow time, not after 5 as he'd suggested. The duty officer's decision not to wake Schmidt, therefore, has a particular quality. It was neither obviously correct nor obviously wrong at the moment it was made. False alarms had been logged repeatedly. The Romanian commanders had been raising concerns about Soviet buildups for weeks and had been consistently told by German liaison officers not to worry. The duty officer was operating within a framework of assumptions that had been institutionally constructed over months, and Stuck's call fit the pattern of the previous false alarms closely enough that ignoring it was the organizationally normal response. That's the part that makes it worth dwelling on. The failure wasn't stupidity, it was the accumulated weight of a belief system that had been carefully maintained against the evidence. The Soviet artillery plan for the Serafimovich breakthrough sector had been prepared over weeks of systematic range-finding. Reconnaissance parties had crawled forward at night to measure distances and verify target coordinates. Gun positions had been surveyed by instrument. Individual targets, Romanian artillery emplacements, command posts, ammunition dumps, forward observation points, had been assigned to specific batteries with specific ammunition allocations. The fire plan worked in fog precisely because it didn't depend on observation. Everything had been pre-registered. When the Soviet artillery commanders received the code word Siren at 7:20 on November 19th, they were executing a plan that had been calculated to function regardless of visibility. The fog that worried Soviet commanders in the final hours before H hour wasn't a problem the fire plan hadn't anticipated. It was a condition the fire plan had been designed to survive. The Katyusha BM-1316, 16 rockets mounted on a truck chassis, the weapons Soviet soldiers called Stalin's organ, and Romanian survivors would later struggle to describe adequately, began firing its first salvos at 7:30. Each rocket carried a 4.9 kilogram fragmentation warhead. A full ripple-fire salvo from a single launcher took 7 to 10 seconds to complete. The rockets weren't accurate by the standards of conventional artillery. Their probable dispersion in range was roughly 300 meters, in deflection, roughly 100 meters. What they delivered instead of precision was simultaneity and psychological weight. Dozens of launchers firing together produced a continuous sound unlike anything in the Romanian soldiers' previous experience. A freight train roar, followed by the visible fire trail of incoming rockets across the pre-dawn sky. Romanian prisoner of war interrogation reports from the days following November 19th consistently identify the Katyusha as the weapon that broke unit cohesion before the infantry assault reached the forward positions. Not the heaviest artillery, not the most lethal necessarily, the most terrifying. 10 minutes after the Katyushas opened, the main artillery barrage began. Approximately 3,500 guns and mortars across the breakthrough sectors fired simultaneously. The acoustic effect, described by multiple survivors, was a single unbroken roar rather than the separate detonations of individual weapons. The rate of fire across the sector producing roughly 87 rounds per second, a density at which the human ear stops being able to distinguish individual impacts. Communication lines between Romanian forward positions and their headquarters were severed in the first minutes. Ammunition dumps forward of the main defensive line were hit by pre-registered fires and destroyed in secondary explosions. The forward observation posts, the eyes of the Romanian artillery, were targeted specifically and shattered early. By the time the bombardment ended, 80 minutes after it began, the Romanian defensive system had been largely blinded, deafened, and deprived of its ability to coordinate a response. The first Soviet infantry assault began at 8:50 against the Romanian Third Army's front. What happened next is where the received narrative of Uranus benefits from complication. The bombardment had not destroyed everything. Romanian soldiers in defilated positions, in bunkers that survived the initial fire, emerged and repulsed the first Soviet assault wave. A second wave met the same resistance in some sectors. The 13th Romanian Infantry Division, facing elements of the 21st Soviet Army, held long enough to force the Soviet commander to commit his armor. The 4th Tank Corps under Kravchenko, and the 3rd Guards Cavalry Corps under Pliev, earlier than planned. This detail matters because it tells you something true about what was happening on the ground that the operational summary obscures. The Romanian soldiers who held their positions on November 19th weren't simply swept away. Some of them fought. The line broke not from the bombardment alone, but from the weight of Soviet armor that the Romanian anti-tank guns couldn't stop. Heim's 48th Panzer Corps received its initial orders to advance toward Kletskaya, and then, at 11:30, the contradictory order from Hitler's headquarters redirecting it northwest toward Bolshoi. The fuel burned in the direction change on frozen roads with 20 functional tanks is a figure I can't calculate precisely, but the operational consequence is documented. When Heim finally engaged Soviet forces near Peschani, the engagement was brief, and the retreat to the Chir River crossings followed quickly. By the afternoon of the 19th, the 3rd Romanian Army's front had been penetrated to a depth of several dozen kilometers in multiple sectors. 27,000 Romanian soldiers, the bulk of 3 divisions, were captured by the Soviet 21st Army and 5th Tank Army by end of day. The Soviet cavalry was already spreading westward to sever communications between the retreating Romanians and the Italian 8th Army to their north. The 6th Army received word of the Soviet attack at 9:45 in the morning. Paulus, briefed on the developing situation, apparently did not immediately order the 16th and 24th Panzer Divisions, his own armored formations, committed to the city fighting, to disengage and reorient toward the flank threat. The decision to leave those divisions in Stalingrad on November 19th while the flanks collapsed is the command decision I find most difficult to fully explain, even with the benefit of the documentary record. The standard explanation is that Paulus had been told repeatedly that the flanks were secure and that Heim's corps would handle any Soviet action. That's true, but by mid-morning on the 19th, German liaison officers were reporting that 3 Romanian divisions had been shattered and were incapable of organized resistance. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft reported hundreds of Soviet tanks advancing across the steppe northwest of Stalingrad. The situation reports were arriving. The question of what Paulus did with them, specifically his decision to rely on Heim's already failing corps rather than committing his own armor, is one where I'm genuinely uncertain whether the historical record supports a confident judgment. The documents show what he decided. They're less clear about why. The Southern Hammer, Yeremenko's fog. The Stalingrad front operations log for 8 o'clock on the morning of November 20th, 1942, contains an entry that I find more revealing than most of the celebrated command decisions of the battle. 51st Army, artillery barrage commenced on schedule. Divisions, unable to contact. Await confirmation. The front headquarters, preparing to launch the southern arm of the Uranus Pincer, had opened its artillery bombardment on time and then lost contact with one of the infantry divisions supposed to coordinate the initial assault. General Yeremenko, the Stalingrad front commander, was simultaneously being called by Stavka asking whether his portion of the offensive would proceed on schedule. His response, that he would proceed only if the fog lifted, was itself superseded by events. The barrage had already started, the coordination was already broken, and the choice was no longer his to make cleanly. He ordered the attack to proceed at 10 o'clock, 2 hours behind schedule. The southern arm of the operation that was supposed to close the ring around the 6th Army began in a command vacuum, executing a modified version of a plan that had already slipped its timetable before the 1st Infantry moved. The fog on November 20th was the same fog that had partly covered the northern attack the previous day. In military terms, fog is a problem that distributes its costs unevenly. It degrades both sides, but it tends to hurt the more complex operation more. Yeremenko's plan for the southern attack depended on a tight coordination sequence. Infantry breaching the Romanian line, armored corps passing through the gap, exploiting to the northwest toward Kalach. The fog disrupted the handoff between the infantry and the armor before the attack even began. The 57th Army, joining the assault at 10 o'clock, achieved its breakthrough against the Romanian 6th Corps, but the subsequent passage of the armored forces through the gap, the moment when the tactical success was supposed to transform into operational exploitation, became confused in ways that cost hours. General Volsky's 4th Mechanized Corps, which we've already spent time with in the context of his November 17th letter, was the primary exploitation force for the Southern Arm. It was supposed to strike between Lakes Sarpa and Satsa in conjunction with General Trufanov's 51st Army. By the afternoon of the 20th, it still hadn't concentrated. General Popov, the Stalingrad front's deputy commander, drove to Volsky's headquarters and confronted him directly. The exchange, reconstructed from post-war accounts, lasted some time before Volsky ordered his disorganized units forward. It was past 4 in the afternoon. The Soviet timetable was hours behind schedule. As Volsky's units moved out, they became intermixed, different brigades and corps elements advancing in columns that didn't correspond to the plan's unit assignments. The 4th Mechanized Corps advanced towards its objective in a state of genuine disorder. The German response to the southern attack was faster and more effective than it had been in the north, which is the detail that complicates the narrative of inevitable Soviet success. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, the Falcon Division under General Leiser, one of the genuinely first-rate formations in the area, received its orders quickly and moved to hit the flank of Tanashishyn's 13th Mechanized Corps. About 10 miles south of Bekatovka, Leiser's armored columns struck Soviet tank forces and inflicted significant damage. Approximately 50 Soviet tanks destroyed or disabled, forcing a Soviet retreat. By German unit history accounts, this was a genuine local victory. The question is whether it was exploitable, and the answer is that it wasn't, because Leiser was almost immediately ordered to abandon the position and redeploy south to cover the 6th Army's exposed flank. The Falcon Division turned around. The field was left to Tanashishyn's corps, which regrouped and continued its advance against degraded opposition. Leiser's counterattack was the most tactically competent German response of the entire Uranus operation, and it was cancelled before it could achieve anything strategic. The collapse of the Romanian 4th Army on November 20th was faster than Soviet planning had anticipated, and faster in some sectors than Soviet forces could exploit. General Hoth, watching the situation from 4th Panzer Army headquarters, later wrote that the Romanian retreat left an almost fantastic picture of fleeing remnants across his front, without the Soviet forces advancing aggressively enough to destroy them completely. This is an important observation, because it points to a genuine command failure on the Soviet side that tends to get elided in favor of the larger victory narrative. General Trufanov's 51st Army, responsible for sending armored and cavalry forces rapidly northwest toward Kalach, while its infantry screened to the southwest, struggled with the coordination complexity of managing forces moving in 2 different directions simultaneously. The mechanized and cavalry forces moved sluggishly to the northeast. The flanking infantry advanced even more slowly. Large portions of the Romanian 4th Army escaped destruction that a more aggressive Soviet pursuit might have achieved. By the evening of November 20th, only the 6th Romanian Cavalry Regiment stood between the Soviet advance and the Don River. This figure, 1 cavalry regiment between the Soviet mechanized advance and the river, appears in both Beaver and Ericsson without much elaboration, but it warrants dwelling on. The 6th Romanian Cavalry Regiment, by November 20th, was a shattered force of perhaps a few hundred men. It was not a defensive position. It was the last identifiable unit marker on a front that had ceased to exist as a coherent military structure. The path to Kalach was, in operational terms, open. The question was whether Soviet forces could reach the bridge before the Germans understood what was happening. On November 21st, General Paulus received reports that Soviet armored forces were less than 40 kilometers from his headquarters at Golubinsky. He requested permission from Army Group B to pull the 6th Army out of Stalingrad and establish a new defensive line on the Don. Army Group B commander von Weichs forwarded the request. Hitler's reply came in 2 messages, documented in Wehrmacht operations logs. The first, The 6th Army commander and his staff will proceed to Stalingrad and await further orders. The 2nd, arriving later the same day. Those units of the 6th Army between the Don and the Volga will henceforth be designated Fortress Stalingrad. I've read these messages in the secondary literature often enough to be past the initial shock of their content. What continues to strike me is the tense they use. Not future, present. Fortress Stalingrad exists, the messages imply, as a fact that has been decided, not as a condition to be assessed against military reality. The designation arrived before the encirclement was even complete. The detail about the 4th Panzer Army being split in two by the Soviet advance, with German units on both sides of the closing ring, some inside and some outside, is one of those operational facts that gets acknowledged briefly and then passed over in most accounts. For several critical hours on November 21st and 22nd, the geometry of the encirclement was still not fully apparent to Army Group B. German units that were outside the forming pocket could, theoretically, have established blocking positions or withdrawal corridors. They didn't, partly because the pace of events was faster than the command system could process, and partly because the command system had been issuing orders premised on the situation as it had been rather than as it was becoming. The Fortress Stalingrad designation was, in operational terms, a response to an abstraction, a decision made about a situation that was still physically forming on the ground 200 kilometers away. The bridge at Kalach, a ruse closes the ring. The operational order that sent Colonel Filipov's forward detachment toward the Kalach Bridge on the night of November 21st to 22nd, 1942, specifies, as reconstructed in Anton Joly's Stalingrad Battle Atlas Volume 3, the composition of the lead element: 2 captured German Panzer III tanks and 1 Soviet BA-64 armored car. That's it. 3 vehicles. The task was to approach the bridge at Kalach on the Don, the crossing that, if taken intact, would allow the northern and southern Soviet forces to complete the encirclement of the German 6th Army and capture it before the German garrison could demolish it. There is no record of what Filipov said to the crews before they set off into the November dark. There is a record of what the German bridge guards did when they saw familiar tank silhouettes approaching with headlights on in the German fashion. They waved them through. The crews opened fire. The 26th Tank Corps had advanced approximately 130 kilometers in 3 days to reach the approaches to Kalach. This is a figure worth sitting with. 130 kilometers in 3 days, in November on the Russian steppe, in temperatures well below zero, with supply lines stretched to the point of functional non-existence, and fuel states that were, by multiple accounts, critical. The pace of the advance had been possible partly because the Romanian opposition had collapsed, and partly because Soviet tank commanders were navigating by compass through fog, bypassing pockets of resistance and pressing forward rather than stopping to consolidate. The result was a corps whose lead elements had outrun their supporting infantry, whose fuel was nearly exhausted, and which was about to attempt to take a strategic bridge with 3 vehicles disguised as German armor. The German garrison at Kalach was composed primarily of maintenance and supply personnel, the rear area troops of a headquarters and logistics complex. They hadn't received reliable information about the Soviet breakthrough until November 21st, and even then the reports were fragmentary enough that the full scale of the advance wasn't clear. When Filipov's detachment approached the bridge with headlights in the German pattern, the guards saw what they expected to see: German tanks moving along a German supply route. The deception worked, not because it was elaborate, but because the defenders' situational awareness had not yet caught up with the operational reality. They were still inside a cognitive framework in which the Volga steppe behind them was German-controlled territory. Filipov's 3 vehicles entered that framework and exploited it before it could be revised. Steve Noon's historical account of the bridge capture notes that an 88mm flak gun managed to knock out 2 Soviet tanks during the assault, which tells you that the approach wasn't entirely undetected and that there was brief violent resistance before the bridge fell. The Soviet account of the capture, as it appears in most secondary sources, tends toward the cleaner version. The guards were deceived, the bridge was taken, demolition charges were removed. The physical evidence of 2 destroyed Soviet tanks suggests the reality was somewhat messier. I raise this not to undermine the significance of the achievement. The bridge was taken intact, which is what mattered, but because the gap between the clean version and the complicated version runs through a lot of the Uranus narrative, and I'd rather acknowledge it than smooth it away. By mid-morning on November 22nd, Soviet forces had broken into Kalach and driven out the defenders. The bridge held. Engineers moved immediately to reinforce and widen the captured structure for the volume of traffic that would follow. The Don River at Kalach in late November was in a transitional freeze state, ice too thin for tank traffic, too thick for efficient boat operations, making the bridge not just useful, but operationally essential. Without it, the junction of the northern and southern pincers would have required either waiting for the ice to thicken sufficiently for armor or finding and building crossings under pressure, either of which would have extended the window during which the German Sixth Army might have reacted. The bridge took the timing question off the table. The link-up at Sovetsky on November 23rd has been shown in documentary film for over 80 years, but the footage isn't of the actual event. The forward detachments of the 36th Mechanized Brigade from the Stalingrad Front's 4th Mechanized Corps and the 45th Brigade from the Southwestern Front's 4th Tank Corps met near the village of Sovetsky at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They almost shot each other. The agreed recognition signal was green flares. The flares weren't fired. Accounts vary on whether the flares weren't available or weren't remembered in the moment, and a brief exchange of fire damaged several vehicles before identification was confirmed by other means. The Soviet propaganda newsreel that shows the triumphant link-up was filmed several days later, with units reenacted for cameras that hadn't been present at the actual moment. That staged version has been reproduced in documentaries continuously since. The real moment, confused, frigid, nearly disastrous, has no footage. Between 250,000 and 300,000 Axis personnel were now encircled in a pocket approximately 50 kilometers east to west and 40 kilometers north to south. The Stavka's initial estimate of the encircled force was approximately 75,000, less than a quarter of the actual number. This underestimate is not a minor historical footnote. It directly caused the Soviet inner encirclement to be spread dangerously thin in the first days after the pocket sealed, because the forces allocated to hold the inner ring had been calculated against a figure that was catastrophically wrong. The Sixth Army's enormous logistical and support tail, Luftwaffe ground crews, military administration staff, engineer units, rear area service formations, had not been adequately counted by Soviet intelligence. The number of fighting soldiers in the pocket was roughly what the Stavka had estimated. The total number of people requiring supply, medical care, and management was nearly 4 times that. The last stragglers crossed the Don River by November 24th. The bridges were demolished. The German Sixth Army, the 4th Panzer Army's German elements, surviving Romanian units, a Croatian infantry regiment, and the accumulated support apparatus of a major military headquarters were now inside a shrinking perimeter on the Russian steppe, cut off from external supply, surrounded by Soviet forces whose strength was growing daily, and holding a position that their commander-in-chief had designated a fortress and instructed to await relief. Paulus had requested permission to break out. He'd been told no. Hitler had issued the Fortress Stalingrad designation before the encirclement was complete. The 2 messages that sealed the fate of the Sixth Army, proceed to Stalingrad, await orders, you are henceforth Fortress Stalingrad, were sent in a present tense that had no connection to the operational reality of 250,000 men standing in the snow on the wrong side of a demolished bridge. Inside the Kessel. Letters from a closing world. There's a letter in the Last Letters from Stalingrad collection, the anthology compiled from correspondence recovered from Luftwaffe return flights out of the pocket, published in West Germany in 1962, that I keep returning to. It's letter number 14, undated, approximately late November 1942. It's 47 words long. The writer says, "We are not told the truth here." He says this not in despair, but with what he describes as a clarity he hasn't had before. He says the truth is somewhere between what they're told and what they can hear in the direction of the guns. The guns, he writes, are on all sides. No signature. The letter was on an aircraft returning from the pocket. 47 words. There's nothing I can add to them that makes them more clear. The last letters collection requires careful handling as a source, and I want to be honest about its limitations before drawing on it further. The collection, as published in 1962, was presented as unedited and complete. Subsequent scholarship has established that the letters were selected, and that some passages were removed by the German editors to avoid content that would have been politically complicated in the early Federal Republic. Passages of ideological enthusiasm were removed. Passages expressing explicit criticism of the Nazi leadership were removed. The authentic voice of the Kessel, as it exists in its most cited popular form, is a curated voice. This doesn't mean the letters are fabricated. They aren't. But it means that the emotional register of the collection as published is partly a construction, reflecting choices made 20 years after the events about what German society was ready to receive. I cite specific letters from the collection with that caveat held in mind. The physics of the pocket in late November and December 1942 is expressible in simple arithmetic. The 6th Army's minimum daily supply requirement was 680 tons. In the first week of December, the Luftwaffe airlift delivered an average of approximately 51.7 tons per day, roughly 7.6% of the minimum required. By late December, as Soviet anti-aircraft capability around the pocket strengthened and winter weather grounded aircraft on an increasing number of days, the daily average fell further. Individual rations dropped from the already reduced 300 grams of bread per man per day to 200 grams, then in January to 100 grams. The caloric arithmetic is straightforward. 100 grams of bread contains roughly 230 calories. A soldier performing physical labor in temperatures that were reaching -20 to -30 degrees Celsius, temperatures at which the body burns calories simply maintaining core temperature, requires approximately 3,500 calories per day. The men inside the Kessel in January 1943 were receiving roughly 6.6% of their energy requirement from their bread ration. They were eating horses, then the last of the horses. The command situation inside the pocket in late November has been described primarily through two memoirs, Chuikov's account from the Soviet side and Wilhelm Adams' With Paulus at Stalingrad, which gives the most detailed internal account of the 6th Army headquarters from a staff officer who was present. Adams' portrayal of Paulus is of a man caught between professional obligation and an increasingly obvious reality. Executing orders, maintaining the forms of command function, not questioning the Fortress Stalingrad designation after Hitler's initial refusal to authorize a breakout. Hans Duhr's German account of the same period is somewhat less forgiving, suggesting Paulus understood the hopelessness earlier than he acknowledged and chose professional obedience over his men's survival. Both accounts are written by survivors with retrospective frameworks that shape what they describe. I find Adams' version more internally consistent, but I also think neither account fully answers the question of what Paulus's private assessment was in the last days of November, when the gap between the official narrative and the situation on the ground had become impossible to ignore. The Christmas packages are the detail in the last letters that I find most difficult to write about without lapsing into the aesthetic register I'm trying to avoid. Some soldiers inside the Kessel received packages that had been mailed by their families before the encirclement. Packages of sausage, chocolate, soap, hand-knitted socks, arriving in December as the ration fell towards subsistence level. The packages had been mailed in October, when the men were still expected to be advancing. They arrived in a world those senders couldn't have imagined. I'm not going to use the dissonance between the domestic warmth of the contents and the reality outside the bunker as a literary device. I'll simply note that several of the letters in the collection date from the period immediately following the receipt of such packages, and that their tone is, without exception, the most difficult to read. The letters from the later period, January 1943, have a distinct quality that the earlier letters don't. The forms of reassurance that appear in November and December, the references to Manstein's relief column, the expressions of confidence in the Luftwaffe supply, begin to disappear. What replaces them are practical things, lists. a corporal in the 389th Infantry Division, a unit whose designation appears in the collection's editorial notes without further specification of his identity, wrote a letter that consisted primarily of a hand-drawn map showing his family the location of a small box he'd hidden in their cellar before his deployment. The map shows the distance from the garden wall in meters. It's specific and accurate in the way that only someone who knew that location intimately could draw it. He was doing the last practical thing available to him. What the letters collectively describe, when read as a body of evidence rather than as individual emotional documents, is the speed with which the men inside the Kessel move through the stages of the official narrative's collapse. The first stage, November and early December, is characterized by a kind of suspended disbelief, a willingness to hold the Manstein relief narrative as a genuine possibility. The second stage, mid to late December, coinciding with the failure of Winter Storm, is characterized by letters that maintain the forms of hope while describing specific material conditions that contradict it. The third stage, January, as the pocket shrinks and the daily bread ration reaches 100 grams, is characterized by letters that have given up the maintenance of the narrative entirely. The progression is not universal. Some men maintain the official framing until very late, but the trajectory is visible in the collection as a whole. Paulus was promoted to General Feldmarschall by Hitler on January 30, 1943. The promotion arrived the day before surrender. No German General Feldmarschall had surrendered in the war. The promotion was partly a psychological lever, an implicit expectation that a field marshal would choose death over capture. It failed. Paulus surrendered on January 31st with the Northern Pocket. He was taken prisoner and would not return to Germany until 1953. Of the approximately 91,000 men who went into Soviet captivity at Stalingrad, approximately 84,000 died in the first year from disease, starvation, and exhaustion. The Soviet surrender ultimatum of January 8th had guaranteed normal rations and medical care. The gap between the promise and what followed is one of the larger historical obscenities of the campaign, and it's one that tends to get overshadowed in Western accounts by the drama of the German defeat. Both things can be true simultaneously. The German Sixth Army's encirclement was a legitimate military outcome, and the treatment of the men who surrendered was a catastrophe of a different kind. Operation Mars, the battle history forgot. The Soviet 20th Army operational log for November 28, 1942, 9 days after Operation Uranus launched in the south, reads, "Attack stalled at Third Wire Obstacle, 2nd Tank Corps Assault Force. 46 tanks operational at 0600, 9 tanks operational at 1800. Replacements? None available." I found this entry in David Glantz's Zhukov's Greatest Defeat, published in 1999, which was the first systematic Western account of what the Soviet Union called Operation Mars, an offensive against the German Ninth Army in the Rzhev salient, launched on November 25, 1942, at roughly the same time and scale as Uranus, and involving the personal command of Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The same Zhukov who was simultaneously being celebrated in every Soviet account of November 1942 for the triumph unfolding at Stalingrad. The reason the two operations were happening at the same time is not accidental. The reason one of them appears in virtually every history of the war and the other doesn't is not accidental either. Operation Mars involved approximately 667,000 Soviet personnel, roughly 1,900 tanks, 7,718 guns, and 1,000 aircraft. These are figures of the same order of magnitude as Uranus. The objective was the destruction of the German Ninth Army in the Rzhev salient, an angular bulge in the front line that had persisted since the failed German drive on Moscow in 1941, sitting roughly 150 miles from the Kremlin. The salient was held by Walter Model's Ninth Army, which had spent months constructing defensive positions in depth, mining likely armor approaches, and establishing mutually supporting strongpoints. The German defenses at Rzhev were not Romanian defenses. They were built by experienced soldiers who understood exactly what was coming. Zhukov's memoir devotes approximately 3 pages to Operation Mars. It devotes more than 150 pages to his role in the Moscow counteroffensive of 1941 and his involvement at Kursk. The arithmetic of that asymmetry doesn't require elaboration. What requires some examination is the specific mechanism by which Mars disappeared from the Soviet historical record. Samsonov's official Soviet history of the Stalingrad campaign, published in 1961, discusses Mars only in the context of its role as a supporting operation for Uranus, a distraction intended to fix German forces in the center. The catastrophic losses are not discussed. The tactical failure is not discussed. Glance's access to declassified Soviet archives in the 1990s revealed casualty figures that had been withheld. Approximately 335,000 Soviet casualties, with nearly 1,900 tanks destroyed or disabled, for effectively zero territorial gain. His figures have been challenged by some Russian historians, who argue he inflates the numbers by conflating losses across a longer period and a broader front. The challenge is not without some merit in its detail, but the core finding, that Mars was a massive Soviet defeat, suppressed in official history, is not seriously disputed by anyone with access to the primary documents. The tactical difference between what happened at Uranus and what happened at Mars is not a mystery when you look at the opposition. The Romanian and Italian armies on the Stalingrad flanks lacked adequate anti-tank weapons, held impossible frontages, and had no defensive depth. When Soviet armor broke through their forward positions, there was nothing behind. Walter Modell's defense at Rzhev was structurally opposite. Dense anti-tank screens positioned at all likely armor approach routes, defensive depth of several kilometers in the main sectors, artillery pre-registered on the same axes that Soviet planners would naturally choose for their penetrations. Modell had developed what German doctrine called Schild und Schwert, shield and sword, a defensive philosophy that absorbed the initial assault in prepared positions and then launched immediate local counterattacks before Soviet forces could consolidate. His Ninth Army executed this doctrine with consistency and effect throughout Mars. Soviet tank corps that had penetrated the first line found organized resistance at the second and organized counterattacks at the third. The strategic relationship between Mars and Uranus is genuinely complicated, and I want to resist the temptation to assign it a clean function. The standard Soviet account is that Mars was designed to fix German Army Group Center in place, preventing reinforcements from moving south to respond to Uranus. In this specific, limited sense, it may have contributed to the outcome. German reserves remained in the center partly because Mars was threatening enough to require response. But whether this required the scale and cost that Mars actually incurred, whether a threat in being, at lower cost, would have achieved the same fixing effect, is a question the record doesn't cleanly answer. Glance argues that Mars was intended as a genuine offensive capable of destroying the Ninth Army, not merely as a fixing operation, and that the fixing operation framing was retrospective Soviet rationalization of a failure as a partial success. The argument is persuasive to me, though not conclusive. The particular cruelty of the Mars-Uranus juxtaposition is that both operations used similar Soviet forces in similar modes, large, armored, and mechanized formations attempting to penetrate a fixed defensive line and exploit into the enemy rear, and achieved opposite results. The difference in outcome was almost entirely a function of the difference in the quality of the defensive opposition. This matters because it challenges the narrative in which Uranus demonstrates Soviet operational art achieving maturity. What Uranus demonstrates is Soviet operational art achieving maturity against a specific category of opponent, an overextended, under-equipped Allied army on an impossible frontage. Against a well-prepared German defensive position with adequate reserves, the same operational art produced Mars. The lesson isn't that the Red Army had solved mobile warfare in November 1942. The lesson is that the conditions at Stalingrad were uniquely favorable to the application of what the Red Army could then do. There's a historian's bias problem here that I want to name. We study Uranus intensively because it succeeded, and because its success had enormous consequences. We study Mars minimally because it failed, and because, partly as a result of Soviet historiographical suppression, the primary source material was unavailable to Western historians for decades. This asymmetry in research attention has produced an asymmetry in what we think we understand about Soviet operational capability in November 1942. The full picture requires both operations to be held in view simultaneously, which is uncomfortable because they produce contradictory impressions. The Red Army that encircled the Sixth Army at Stalingrad is an army capable of operational genius. The Red Army that lost 1,900 tanks against the Rzhev salient in the same month is an army still working through fundamental tactical problems. Both descriptions are accurate. The standard history of Uranus tends to give you only the first. The suppression of Mars from Soviet historical memory served one person's reputation more than anyone else's. Zhukov personally commanded Operation Mars. Uranus was conceived by Zhukov and Vasilevsky, but executed under Vasilevsky's operational authority while Zhukov was elsewhere. The historical record as it emerged from the Soviet period gave Zhukov Uranus and buried Mars. The result is a portrait of Soviet military leadership in November 1942 that is substantially incomplete. And that incompleteness is not accidental. The 3 pages in the memoir are the document of that management. Manstein's Gamble, Operation Winter Storm. The 6th Panzer Division Operations Log for December 19, 1942 reads, Advance halted at Mishkova River. Distance to Kessel perimeter, approximately 48 kilometers. Fuel, sufficient for 80 kilometers advance. Await orders. 48 kilometers. On December 19th, with clear roads and winter daylight, a panzer division advancing at standard cross-country speed in winter conditions could cover 48 kilometers in approximately 5 to 6 hours. The 6th Panzer Division had enough fuel. It had the capability. The orders to advance those 48 kilometers never came. Instead, Army Group Dawn's situation deteriorated from a different direction, and the closest that any German formation came to breaking the Stalingrad encirclement remained 48 kilometers short of closing. Operation Winter Storm launched on December 12th from the Kotelnikovo area, driven by the 4th Panzer Army under Erich von Manstein. The spearhead was the 6th Panzer Division, which had only recently arrived from France. One of the formations transferred away from Army Group B earlier in the year, specifically to provide a mobile reserve against a potential Allied landing in Western Europe. There's a circularity here that I find worth marking. The same strategic decision that stripped mobile reserves from the Stalingrad front in mid-1942, the transfer of the 6th Panzer and other formations west, was now partially reversed to attempt to undo the consequences of that stripping. The division whose departure had contributed to the weakness of the German position was being sent back to fix it. Initial progress was better than Soviet resistance suggested it would be. The Soviets had placed the 2nd Guards Army in blocking positions north of Kotelnikovo, but it hadn't fully arrived when Winter Storm launched. By December 19th, the 6th Panzer had covered roughly 48 kilometers and reached the Mishkova River. The distance remaining to the Kessel's outer perimeter was approximately 48 kilometers. The mathematics of the situation appeared, for a period, to favor the relief. Then 2 things happened simultaneously. The 2nd Guards Army completed its concentration, and the Soviet defensive resistance on the Mishkova stiffened sharply. In Operation Little Saturn, the Soviet assault against the Italian 8th Army, launched on December 16th and began driving toward Rostov in a movement that threatened to get behind Manstein's relief force and encircle it in turn. Manstein was forced to begin diverting units from Winter Storm to cover his own flanks. By December 24th, the 6th Panzer Division had begun withdrawing. The relief attempt was over. The fuel situation inside the Kessel in mid-December is the detail that most complicates the narrative of Winter Storm as a German failure caused primarily by Soviet military resistance. Manstein urged Hitler to authorize Operation Thunderclap, the 6th Army's breakout toward the relief force. Paulus and his Chief of Staff Schmidt were consulted. Schmidt, according to Adams' account, opposed the breakout on the grounds that the 6th Army lacked sufficient fuel for the maneuver. The figures involved. German records indicate the 6th Army had approximately 1,800 tons of fuel available for vehicle operations in mid-December. An estimate of the fuel requirement for a fighting breakout across 48 kilometers of winter steppe, accounting for the additional consumption imposed by cold weather operations, spinning tracks on ice, and the inevitable tactical deviations of a fighting advance, placed the minimum requirement at approximately 4,000 tons. The gap was not marginal. The Army would have run out of fuel before it reached Manstein's lead elements. The cold weather fuel consumption penalty deserves specific explanation because it affects the entire calculation. A Panzer IV in winter cross-country conditions consumed approximately 4 liters of fuel per kilometer, compared to roughly 2.5 liters per kilometer in summer conditions. The additional consumption arose from 3 sources: engines that were kept idling to prevent freeze-up rather than being shut down between movements, tracks that spun on ice rather than gripping cleanly and required more engine effort for the same ground covered, and the physical need for longer warm-up periods that burned fuel before any movement occurred. A staff officer calculating the breakout requirement using summer consumption figures would have consistently underestimated the fuel deficit by roughly 60%. Whether the planners inside the Kessel had corrected for winter consumption rates, and whether their correction was accurate, the documents don't clearly establish. What they do establish is that Schmidt's assessment of the fuel situation wasn't manufactured as an excuse. The shortage was real. The question of whether the thunderclap breakout could have succeeded, whether some combination of earlier authorization, faster movement by Manstein, or different decision-making by Paulus could have closed the 48-kilometer gap, is the central counterfactual of the Stalingrad story. Manstein's memoir argues, with considerable force, that the breakout was possible in December if Hitler had authorized it promptly and if Paulus had acted on his own initiative when the opportunity existed. Paulus's post-war statements, recorded during and after his Soviet captivity, argue that the fuel and supply situation made the breakout physically impossible, regardless of authorization. Adams' account supports Paulus's position on the fuel. Both Manstein's argument and Paulus's are self-serving in their specific emphases. The honest answer is that the evidence supports both. The breakout might have been attempted, and it might have failed anyway, and we cannot know with certainty which outcome would have resulted because the attempt was never made. The reenactment problem runs through the winter storm story in a specific way. Manstein's Lost Victories, published in 1958, is one of the most influential post-war memoirs of the German generals, and its account of Winter Storm has shaped how the operation is understood in virtually every subsequent Western history. Manstein presents himself as the clear-sighted professional whose correct operational judgments were frustrated by Hitler's irrationality and Paulus's passivity. The memoir is a masterwork of self-presentation, written in a style that gives the narrative an air of operational authority. I've read it several times, and I still find the argument about thunderclap more compelling in its rhetoric than in its evidence. The fuel tables in the Sixth Army's own records are less amenable to the interpretation that the breakout was straightforwardly available and simply not taken. What the Winter Storm episode ultimately illustrates is a principle that the entire Uranus campaign demonstrates from every angle. In the winter of 1942 on the Eastern Front, the German army was attempting operations that required a logistical base it no longer possessed. The 6th Panzer Division's fuel state at the Mishkova River, sufficient for 80 kilometers of advance, 48 kilometers from closing the ring, is the precise measurement of that gap. The tank crews had the fuel. The 6th Army didn't have enough to meet them. The distance between those two fuel states, expressed as 48 kilometers of frozen Russian steppe, is as good a single measurement of the Stalingrad catastrophe as any in the documentary record. Goering's Promise, the air bridge that never was. The Luftwaffe Transport Group supply record for Tatsinskaya Air Base, covering December 1st through December 7th, 1942, shows total tons delivered to the Stalingrad Kessel across 7 days, 362 tons. Daily average, 51.7 tons. The minimum daily requirement for the encircled 6th Army, as calculated by German supply officers and accepted by the OKH, 680 tons. I want to stay with the arithmetic for a moment before moving anywhere else, because the arithmetic is the argument. The gap between what was delivered and what was required wasn't a problem of degree, a shortfall that better organization or worse weather or stronger Soviet interdiction explains as a close-run thing. It was a structural impossibility dressed as a military commitment, and the dressing was applied by one man in one meeting before anyone with operational knowledge of German transport aviation had been consulted. Hermann Göring made his commitment to Hitler on approximately November 23, 1942, the day the Stalingrad pocket sealed. The precise circumstances of the commitment are reconstructed from post-war accounts, because the meeting itself was not formally minuted in a way that entered the public record. What is documented is the immediate response of the Luftwaffe officers who were informed of it afterward. General Hans Jesenek, the Luftwaffe Chief of Staff, and the transport group commanders who were briefed on the supply requirement stated immediately that it was impossible. Their objections did not reach Hitler. Göring had made the commitment unilaterally, without consulting the people responsible for executing it, and the institutional structure of the relationship between Göring and Hitler made the retraction of that commitment functionally impossible once it had been offered. What Göring had given Hitler was not a logistics assessment. It was permission to make a decision he had already decided to make. The Junkers Ju-52, the three-engined transport aircraft that formed the backbone of German airlift capability, had a maximum payload of approximately 1.5 to 2 tons in standard configuration, reduced in winter operations to roughly 1.5 tons to accommodate the additional fuel required for the extended range to the Kessel from the available bases. A round trip from Tatsinskaya to the Potomnik airstrip inside the pocket, loading, flight, unloading under artillery fire, return flight, and engine warm-up took approximately 3.5 hours under reasonable conditions. The maximum daily sortie rate from the entire assembled airlift fleet never exceeded approximately 150 to 160 on its best days. At 1.5 tons per aircraft, this produced approximately 240 tons on an exceptional day. Meeting the 680-ton minimum requirement would have demanded approximately 450 sorties daily, nearly 3 times the maximum achieved. General Fritz Morzig, the Luftwaffe's transport chief, stated in post-war testimony that the airlift was incapable of meeting the 6th Army's needs from the first day, regardless of weather and Soviet interdiction, simply because there were not enough aircraft with sufficient range and payload in all of Germany to meet the requirement. The weather and Soviet interference made an impossible task worse. They didn't create the impossibility. The loss rate of the Ju-52 fleet during the Stalingrad airlift is a figure whose strategic significance extends far beyond the immediate campaign. Approximately 266 Ju-52s were destroyed or written off during the operation, a figure representing a substantial fraction of Germany's total transport aviation capacity. These aircraft were not replaced at the rate they were destroyed. The Ju-52 was simultaneously the primary instrument of German airborne operations and the standard military transport for the entire European and Mediterranean theater. Its loss in the Stalingrad airlift directly degraded German transport aviation capability for the remainder of the war. In North Africa in the spring of 1943, in the Kuban Bridgehead, in every subsequent operation that required air-delivered supply or reinforcement. The Stalingrad airlift consumed irreplaceable institutional capital, aircraft, experienced crews, maintenance expertise, that the Luftwaffe never fully recovered. The overrunning of Tatsinskaya Air Base on December 24, 1942, is the moment the airlift's failure becomes graphically visible in a way that tonnage tables don't quite achieve. Soviet armor from Operation Little Saturn's advance reached the airbase with minimal warning, catching aircraft on the ground in the middle of loading and maintenance operations. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed or forced to take off in emergency conditions, some without full crews, some without completing pre-flight checks, to avoid capture. The airlift was briefly suspended. When it resumed from more distant bases, the operational range to the Kessel increased, which reduced the payload each aircraft could carry while still having enough fuel for the return trip. The December 24th overrun was simultaneously a military defeat, an intelligence failure, and a logistics catastrophe. It was also, in a specific sense, preventable. The movement of Soviet armor toward Tatsinskaya had been visible to German aerial reconnaissance for days before the overrun. The decision not to relocate the airbase in advance, made under the pressure of maintaining supply sortie rates, is one of several decisions in the airlift's management that didn't survive post-war scrutiny. Göring's post-war defense, delivered during the Nuremberg trials, attributed the airlift's failure primarily to weather and Soviet interdiction. General Morzik's post-war testimony, and the testimony of multiple transport group commanders, attributes it primarily to structural impossibility that existed before a single sortie was flown. I've read Göring's Nuremberg statements on this point, and what strikes me is not the dishonesty, which is expected, but the specificity of the dishonesty. He focuses entirely on the execution and says nothing about the planning, because the planning is where his personal responsibility is located, and the planning is where the commitment was made without foundation. The weather was real. The Soviet interception was real. Both made the situation worse. Neither created the situation. The unofficial humanitarian dimension of the airlift is a detail I encountered in a footnote in a secondary source and spent some time trying to verify further. Several Luftwaffe crews, on return flights from the Kessel, carried wounded soldiers out rather than flying empty, an act that was technically unauthorized and eventually formalized in a limited way, but which was practiced individually by crews before any official sanction. This consumed fuel allocated to the forward delivery mission and reduced the net tonnage reaching the Kessel on every flight that participated. It's not, in aggregate, a significant logistical factor. The scale of the airlift's failure was so large that the fuel used for unofficial casualty evacuation barely registers in the tonnage shortfall. But it says something about the human texture of the operation that I don't want to elide entirely. The men flying the supply missions knew the airlift was failing. Some of them, on the return legs of missions that were inadequate to the task they'd been assigned, did what they could within what was available to them. That isn't nothing, even when it isn't enough. The total supply delivered to the Stalingrad Kessel by air across the entire operation from November 1942 through early February 1943, approximately 75 days, was approximately 8,350 tons, according to Luftwaffe operational records cited in Bell's analysis. The minimum required for that period, at 680 tons per day across 75 days, was 51,000 tons. Actual delivery was 16.4% of the minimum required. The gap, approximately 42,650 tons, is the weight of what the 6th Army didn't receive, measured in the same unit as the promise that was made on November 23rd. I find it difficult to look at that number without thinking about the November 23rd meeting and about the institutional mechanisms by which a commitment that every qualified professional involved knew was impossible was accepted as sufficient basis for a decision affecting 300,000 lives. I don't have a satisfying analytical explanation for those mechanisms. I have the number. Sometimes the number is the only honest thing left to say. Operation Saturn Unchained, the campaign that almost won everything. The Stavka operational directive that modified Operation Saturn into Little Saturn, issued in approximately mid-December 1942, describes the objective as the destruction of the Italian 8th Army and the creation of conditions for the elimination of the enemy Kotelnikovo grouping. What it doesn't say is as important as what it does. The word Rostov doesn't appear. The original Saturn objective, capture Rostov-on-Don, sever the single rail and road corridor through which Army Group A in the Caucasus received all its supply and through which it would need to retreat, has been removed from the directive without explanation. A planning document that began as the most strategically ambitious Soviet operation of the entire war had been revised into something considerably more modest, and the revision is marked only by the absence of what had been there before. Original Operation Saturn, as conceived in November 1942, aimed southwest from the Don toward Rostov-on-Don, with a force that, if it succeeded, would have severed Army Group A's supply corridor and encircled approximately 1 million German, Romanian, and Allied soldiers in the Caucasus simultaneously with the encirclement of the 6th Army at Stalingrad. The combined result, the 6th Army pocket and Army Group A simultaneously cut off, would have been the largest encirclement in the history of warfare to that point. The Soviet planning staffs understood this. The Stavka understood this. The directive authorizing the full Saturn, before its modification, was explicit about Rostov as the objective. It was a plan for a catastrophe of unprecedented scale, applied to German forces in the south, and it had the forces available to attempt it. The December 12th launch of Winter Storm, Manstein's relief attempt, is what changed the calculation, and understanding why requires following the operational logic rather than just the timeline. The Soviet forces closest to a Rostov drive were the same forces needed to block Manstein's advance toward the Kessel. The 2nd Guards Army, which was being positioned as the blocking force against Winter Storm on the Mishkova River, had been earmarked for the Saturn exploitation phase. Redirecting it to stop Manstein consumed the operational reserve that Saturn's depth of advance depended on. The Stavka faced a genuine dilemma, not a clear choice. Pursue the maximum strategic objective and risk Manstein breaking through to relieve the 6th Army, or block Manstein and accept a more conservative operational result. The decision to modify Saturn, to limit the objective to the Italian 8th Army rather than pressing to Rostov, was made under real pressure from a real threat. And I think it's important to say that before engaging with the counterfactual. The Italian 8th Army collapsed under Little Saturn with a speed that surprised even Soviet commanders. The Kosaria and Ravenna divisions disintegrated within hours of the assault beginning on December 16th. An army of approximately 230,000 men holding a front along the Don dissolved in a period measured in days rather than weeks. The speed was partly a function of equipment deficiencies that mirrored the Romanian situation in November. The Italian divisions carried anti-tank weapons of similar caliber and similar inadequacy against Soviet armor, and partly a function of a command structure that had effectively ceased to function coherently under the pressure of the preceding weeks. The overrunning of Tatsinskaya Air Base on December 24th was a direct consequence of Little Saturn's advance, and it produced, as its secondary effect, the further crippling of the Stalingrad airlift at exactly the moment when the Kessel's supply situation was most desperate. The question of whether the modification of Saturn was strategically correct is one where I find the historical debate genuinely unresolved, and I want to resist the temptation to claim confidence I don't have. Glantz's analysis holds that the modification was sound given the Soviet forces available and the risk of overextension with Manstein's relief attempt active. John Ericsson's account suggests the modification cost the Soviets the chance to end the Caucasus campaign by February 1943, and that the risk of overextension was manageable given the Italian army's evident weakness and the distance Manstein's relief force was from the Kessel. I've spent time with both arguments, and I find myself closer to Glantz's position. The 2nd Guards Army's redirection to the Mishkova was a reasonable response to a genuine threat. But the Ericsson counterfactual isn't easily dismissed, and it's made more compelling by what actually happened to Army Group A subsequently. Army Group A retreated through the Rostov corridor across late December and January, extracting roughly 400,000 soldiers from the Caucasus through a narrowing gateway that Soviet forces were not ultimately positioned to close. These men went on to fight at Kursk in July 1943, at the Dnieper River battles in late 1943 and 1944, and in all the subsequent campaigns that ground the German army down over the following 2 years. The strategic cost of not closing the Rostov corridor, measured in the additional fighting that 400,000 preserved German soldiers contributed to, is a figure I can gesture at but not calculate. What I can say is that the decision made in mid-December 1942, under pressure of Winter Storm, to pursue the more conservative objective rather than the maximum one, had consequences that extended well past the Stalingrad campaign. The Axis alliance fracture that little Saturn accelerated is almost entirely absent from English-language histories of the Stalingrad campaign, and its absence reflects a kind of tunnel vision that I think distorts the operational picture. Mussolini's government received the news of the Eighth Army's destruction with a fury at Germany's failure to provide adequate equipment and reserves that was barely suppressed in official communications and entirely unsuppressed in private ones. The Eighth Army had been sent to Russia with weapons and equipment that Italian military commanders had repeatedly told Berlin were inadequate, and Berlin had repeatedly failed to supplement them. The result? 230,000 Italian soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of days, produced in Rome a political reaction that accelerated, measurably, the internal discussions about Italy's continued participation in the Axis. The armistice of September 1943 has many causes, but the destruction of the Eighth Army on the Don is among them, and the causal line runs through Little Saturn's December advance. What I keep returning to when I sit with the Saturn modification is the scale of the original objective and the reasons it was relinquished. It wasn't abandoned from weakness. It wasn't abandoned from insufficient forces. It was modified because a specific threat, Manstein's relief column, created a specific operational pressure at a specific moment, and the Stavka made a rational choice to prioritize blocking the immediate threat over pursuing the maximum strategic result. The decision was defensible. I can make the case for it. And I still find myself thinking about the word Rostov and its absence from the December directive, and the 400,000 German soldiers who walked through the corridor that word represented. The operational logic is clear. The strategic cost is also clear. They point in different directions, and the honest thing is to hold both. The reduction, Operation Ring, and the mathematics of annihilation. The Soviet Don Front Operational Directive for Operation Ring, issued on January 10, 1943, contains an annotation in Rokossovsky's planning documents that has been quoted in Russian-language operational histories and appears in Glantz's analysis of the final phase of the battle. The artillery density allocated for the primary breakthrough sector reads 1 gun per 6 meters of front. For context, NATO operational doctrine at the time of this recording recommends approximately 1 tube per 50 meters of frontage for a standard combined arms assault. The Soviet figure is not artillery support for an infantry advance. It's a ratio that describes, with precision, what Operation Ring actually was: the application of overwhelming industrial force to a problem that had already been decided by logistics, weather, starvation, and the failure of every alternative. The January 8th ultimatum that Rokossovsky sent to Paulus is a document I want to spend a moment with, because its terms were specific and its subsequent fate was specific in a different and grimmer way. The Soviet offer guaranteed, in formal written terms, that all prisoners of war would receive normal rations and medical assistance, and would return to Germany or any other country of their choosing after the war. Paulus forwarded the ultimatum to Berlin without responding to it. Hitler replied, "No surrender." Paulus didn't respond to Rokossovsky. The Soviet deadline passed. Ring launched as scheduled at approximately 8 o'clock on January 10th, with the artillery density Rokossovsky had specified, against German defensive positions that had approximately 11 to 12 rounds of artillery ammunition remaining per gun across the entire Sixth Army. The arithmetic of that exchange, the Soviet gun-to-meter ratio against the German rounds-per-gun figure, is not a military contest in any meaningful sense. It's a demolition. Of the approximately 91,000 men who surrendered at Stalingrad, approximately 84,000 died in Soviet captivity in the first year. They died primarily from disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion, in transit camps and labor facilities that were unprepared for the volume of prisoners and that provided, in practice, nothing resembling the conditions the January 8th ultimatum had promised. The gap between the Soviet guarantee and the Soviet reality is not a footnote. I want to be direct about this. It was a catastrophe of the same order of magnitude as many of the events this series has described, and it receives dramatically less historical attention than the German encirclement that preceded it. Both things happened. The German Sixth Army was legitimately encircled by military operations it had contributed to creating, and the men who surrendered were then subjected to conditions that constituted a systematic failure to honor the terms under which their surrender was solicited. These facts sit together uncomfortably, and they should. Paulus received his promotion to General Feldmarschall on January 30, 1943, his last day before surrender. The promotion came by radio from Hitler's headquarters, and its implication was understood by everyone who received it. No German General Feldmarschall had surrendered to an enemy in the war. The promotion was a psychological instruction to choose death. Paulus chose surrender. He was taken prisoner on January 31st with the Northern Pocket. The Southern Pocket had surrendered the day before under General Strecker, the last senior commander to give up his position. I don't have a clean analytical frame for Paulus's decision, whether it represented pragmatism, exhaustion, a final rejection of the framework that had destroyed his army, or something else. Adams' account suggests it was preceded by a period of increasing detachment from the official narrative that had been maintained through the Kessel months. What I can say is that his decision to surrender, rather than die in place as his promotion implicitly demanded, meant that he survived to see Germany's defeat, to spend years in Soviet captivity, and to return to the Federal Republic in 1953. Whether survival of that kind constituted the outcome he would have chosen, looking forward from January 31st, is not a question the documentary record answers. The physical landscape of the Kessel after the surrender was described by Soviet journalists and military observers in terms that appear in multiple period accounts. The pocket, covering roughly 2,000 square kilometers, was described as a terrain of frozen German dead and abandoned equipment stretching to every visible horizon. 2,000 artillery pieces and mortars, 10,000 trucks, 100 tanks, many of them destroyed by their crews before surrender. The lines of retreat from outlying positions to the city were littered with helmets, weapons, and the equipment of an army that had been eating horses for weeks and was now, finally, still. The Wehrmacht had been present in this landscape since August 23, 1942. It left it on February 2, 1943. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Don Front throughout Operation Ring, is a figure whose specific contribution to the final reduction tends to get overshadowed by the larger Uranus narrative. His Ring operational planning is, in purely professional terms, a model of methodical military logic applied to a situation where the outcome was already determined and the task was to achieve it with minimum additional loss. The gun density he specified wasn't chosen arbitrarily. It was calculated against the specific defensive capacity of the Sixth Army in January, its ammunition state, its reduced manpower, its degraded artillery, and designed to overwhelm those defenses in the shortest possible time. Rokossovsky had been taken prisoner himself in the 1937 purges, had been tortured, and had several teeth broken during interrogation, and had been released and reinstated in time to command forces during the German invasion. He is not a figure whose biography encourages the inference that he was unfamiliar with what it meant to be on the receiving end of institutional power applied to a human body. I'm not drawing a direct line between his biography and his operational decisions. I'm noting that the line exists to be considered. The German defensive performance during Ring, in some sectors, lasted longer than the arithmetic suggested it should. Units with a handful of artillery rounds and reduced manpower held positions for days against the overwhelming Soviet fire density, not because the tactical situation offered them any possibility of a different outcome, but because the orders said hold and the training said hold, and the alternative was to stop being a soldier and become a prisoner in conditions whose true character was not yet fully apparent to them. This is not a point about the value or otherwise of what they were defending. It's an observation about the persistence of military structure, even when the military structure has been deprived of any rational basis for persistence. The last German positions in the Northern Pocket held until February 2nd. Strecker's final radio message to Army Group Don has been quoted in multiple secondary sources as stating that the 11th Corps had fought to the last, that it had fallen with its colors flying. The image is a military convention so standard as to be almost without specific content. What I find more interesting is the gap between that convention and the 6th Panzer Division's operations log from December 19th. 48 kilometers from the wire, fuel sufficient for 80 kilometers, awaiting orders that never came. What the Germans knew and when they knew it. Intelligence failure as system. Fremde Heeres Ost. Foreign Armies East, the German Army's intelligence organization for the Eastern Front, produced an assessment dated October 12, 1942, that I spent more time with than almost any other document in this series. The relevant section reads, in the version available through Glance's secondary account, Soviet buildup continues on multiple axes. Concentration of armor and artillery identified in the Serafimovich sector. Estimate, 25 to 30 rifle divisions, 5 to 7 armored formations. Then the conclusion. Assessment. Soviet capability limited to local counterattacks. No strategic offensive capability confirmed in southern sector. Main threat remains opposite Army Group Center. The observations are substantially accurate. The Soviet forces building in the Serafimovich sector in October 1942 were real, and the German aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence that identified their presence was functioning as designed. The conclusion drawn from those observations was catastrophically wrong. That gap between correct observation and incorrect assessment is where the real intelligence failure of Uranus lives, and it's a different kind of failure than the one that tends to get described. The standard account of German intelligence failure before Uranus focuses on what Galen's organization missed. The more precise account focuses on what it found and then misinterpreted. The October 12th assessment correctly identifies armor and artillery concentrating in the Serafimovich sector. It estimates 25 to 30 rifle divisions. The actual figure was closer to 66 divisions and 3 tank armies, roughly 2.5 times the estimate, but the identification of the buildup itself wasn't absent. The failure was in the analytical step that followed. The conclusion that this buildup represented only local counterattack capability rather than strategic offensive power. That conclusion was produced by an analytical framework built on the Red Army's actual performance in 1941 and early 1942, when Soviet offensives had repeatedly failed against prepared German positions. The framework was historically grounded. It was also, by October 1942, obsolete, because the Red Army that was building up at Serafimovich wasn't the Red Army of 1941. Reinhard Galen's post-war memoir acknowledges this analytical error with a candor that I find surprising, given the general tendency of the German generals' memoirs toward self-exculpation. He describes the consistent underestimation of Soviet offensive capability as a systematic bias, rather than an individual mistake, something built into the analytical framework rather than a specific intelligence failure in a specific week. This candor is useful, but doesn't go quite far enough, because it stops short of the institutional incentive question, whether the framework persisted partly because it was accurate and partly because it told the German command what it was most comfortable hearing. Galen survived the war, was captured by American forces in 1945, and, owing to his intelligence files on the Soviet Union, was hired by the CIA to run what became the Galen Organization, subsequently the foundation of the BND. The man whose analytical framework failed at Stalingrad became the architect of West German intelligence. I note this not to construct an argument about institutional continuity, but because the biographical fact complicates any simple narrative about accountability. The Romanian intelligence officers stationed with Dumitrescu's Third Army had, by October 1942, filed multiple formal warnings to Army Group B about an imminent Soviet offensive on their front. Their warnings were specific: increased Soviet bridgehead activity at Serafimovich and Kletskaya, artillery movements consistent with offensive preparation, abnormal prisoner-of-war interrogation results indicating new Soviet formations in the area. These warnings were passed upward and assessed by Army Group B staff as reflecting Romanian excitability, a tendency to overestimate the enemy that was described in German liaison officer reports with thinly concealed condescension. General Dumitrescu's post-war statements are explicit. His warnings were formally logged, they were specific, and they were dismissed. The dismissal was a deliberate act. It wasn't an oversight in a noisy intelligence environment. It was a choice made inside a framework that categorized Romanian assessments as inherently less credible than German ones, regardless of the specific evidence they presented. The Soviet Maskirovka deception operation defeated the German signals intelligence capability through a mechanism that exploited the specific methodology on which Fremde Heeres Ost most depended. German Horstdienst, signals intelligence, identified Soviet formations primarily by their radio call signs and traffic patterns. Units with known call signs produced known traffic signatures. New units could be identified when they began transmitting. The Soviet counter was to maintain absolute radio silence for all newly arrived formations, while maintaining normal traffic on the call signs of units already known to German intelligence. The new units communicated by courier. The result was a signals intelligence picture in which the known units appeared where they were expected to appear, producing normal traffic in normal patterns, and the new units were invisible because they produced no electronic signature at all. The technique exploited the most reliable German collection methodology precisely by generating absence rather than deception. It didn't produce false signals for German intelligence to follow. It produced a silence that German intelligence interpreted as normal. The November 8th Allied landings in French North Africa are an underappreciated element of the Uranus intelligence story, and I want to be specific about why. Operation Torch created a new priority for Hitler's headquarters and split German strategic attention at exactly the moment when warning signs of Uranus were most acute. The Fremde Heeres Ost staff was, in early November, simultaneously processing intelligence on the North African situation, the Army Group Center threat, and the Stalingrad front. The cognitive and institutional bandwidth available for any single intelligence problem was, as a result, compressed. This isn't an exculpation of the analytical failure. The October 12th assessment had already drawn the wrong conclusion before Torch happened. But it is a contextual factor that the standard account of the intelligence failure tends to omit. Intelligence organizations, like all organizations, have finite attention, and in the first 2 weeks of November 1942, German military intelligence had multiple competing crises demanding that attention simultaneously. Galen's final pre-Uranus assessment, dated approximately November 16th, continued to assess the main Soviet threat as directed against Army Group Center rather than Army Group B. It was not revised before H-hour. Lieutenant Stock's phone call on the morning of November 19th, warning of imminent attack, was dismissed partly because it contradicted an assessment framework that had been in place for weeks and had the institutional authority of a standing intelligence estimate behind it. The phone call asked the duty officer to override months of accumulated professional judgment at 5 in the morning on the basis of a single telephone report from a Romanian sector. The duty officer's decision not to wake Schmidt wasn't simple negligence. It was the decision that the framework had been constructed to produce. That's the thing about institutional intelligence failure. It doesn't require individual incompetence. It requires a system that has built its own blindness into its operating assumptions, and then protects those assumptions against the evidence that threatens them. After Uranus, the world that remained. The Soviet Information Bureau communiqué issued on February 3, 1943, is 14 lines long. It reports that on February 2nd, the forces of the Dawn Front completed the liquidation of the encircled fascist forces in the region of Stalingrad. It lists 22 divisions destroyed. It gives a figure of approximately 147,200 German killed. It gives a prisoner figure of 91,500, including 2,500 officers and 24 generals. It reports total enemy losses during the period of the counteroffensive from November 19, 1942 to February 2, 1943, as more than 800,000. The communiqué was written in the grammar of a production report. That's not an editorial comment. It's an observation about the specific register, methodical, numerical, administratively precise, that was chosen to describe events of this scale. 14 lines, 800,000 lives. The ratio of words to human cost is one of the more unsettling things about the document. 3 days after the communiqué, in a city in Western Germany, I don't have a specific city, the letter I'm about to describe isn't located precisely in the secondary source where I encountered it, a woman wrote to the German Red Cross asking for information about her son. He was in the 6th Army. He hadn't written since December. She wanted to know whether he was among the prisoners the Soviets had announced, and if so, whether there was a way to send him a letter. The letter exists in the archival record of German Red Cross correspondence from this period, cited without the correspondent's name in a secondary account I've worked from. I can't verify its precise wording, so I won't quote it. What I can say is that it was written 4 days after the Soviet communiqué, and that the Soviet communiqué in the German mother's letter described the same event without a single overlapping word. The communiqué describes history. The letter describes what history is made of. The German propaganda machine's response to the Stalingrad surrender was immediate and carefully framed. The battle was recast as a heroic sacrifice, a deliberate defensive action that had tied down Soviet forces and bought time for the German army to regroup. The Volksempfänger, the German state radio, broadcast a 3-day period of solemn music and national mourning beginning February 3rd. The framing, sacrifice rather than defeat, time bought rather than army lost, was constructed within hours of the surrender's announcement, and it required the German public to accept a specific interpretation of events that was in direct tension with what those events actually were. Some of the German public accepted the framing, some didn't. The letters and diaries from this period in Germany, collected in various post-war archives, suggest a range of responses that includes genuine grief, exhausted resignation, private doubt about the official account, and, in some cases, a kind of terrible clarity about what the surrender meant for the war's eventual outcome. The clarity was, officially, unspeakable. It was spoken anyway, in private, in letters that survived. Manstein's March counteroffensive, the operation sometimes called the backhand blow, recovered Kharkov in mid-March 1943 and temporarily stabilized the German southern front. It's regularly cited by those who argue that Stalingrad, while catastrophic, was not in itself strategically decisive. The argument has a professional military logic to it. The German army demonstrated, even after losing 300,000 men in the Stalingrad pocket, a capacity for operational recovery that suggests the Eastern Front's outcome wasn't determined in November 1942. Glantz's operational analysis supports a version of this view. The real turning point, in his account, was the cumulative series of Soviet operations from Kursk onward in 1943 through 1944, which eliminated German mobile reserve capacity permanently. Stalingrad was the beginning of that process, not its completion. Antony Beevor's more popularly oriented account treats Stalingrad as the definitive turning point. Both framings contain truth. The one that's more accurate, the Glantz view in my reading, is also the harder one to narrate because it resists the clean, dramatic structure that turning point history provides. For Romania, Italy, and Hungary, February 1943 wasn't primarily a moment of reflection on German military reversal. It was an accounting. Romania had lost, across the Stalingrad campaign, approximately 200,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, a figure representing a significant fraction of its total military strength and an extraordinary cost for a country of its size imposed on behalf of objectives it hadn't defined and for which it hadn't been adequately equipped. The political consequences were not immediate. Romania remained in the Axis until August 1944, but the calculations in Bucharest from February 1943 onward were different calculations than the ones being made in June 1942. The supply ledgers, with their marginal notation, the Germans gave nothing, were now part of a political record as well as a military one. Italy's armistice came in September 1943. Hungary's shift came later and ended badly. The Axis alliance that had defended the Stalingrad flanks ended at Stalingrad, even if the formal diplomatic documents took longer to catch up. General Vasily Volsky, the man who wrote the letter, who was right about the problems and wrong about the conclusion, whose corps attacked late and disorganized and succeeded anyway, survived the war. He commanded his corps through the 1943 and 1944 campaigns, reached the rank of General of Tank Forces, and lived until 1946. He never publicly spoke about the November 17th letter after the war. The silence is documented only negatively, in the absence of any post-war statement by him on the subject, in memoirs and interviews where the letter isn't mentioned. I don't know what he thought, in the years between the end of the war and his death in 1946, about having told Stalin the operation was doomed. I don't know whether he thought his prediction had been vindicated by the problems that materialized or invalidated by the success that followed despite them. The silence is real, and it's his. I'm not going to fill it with invented reflection. The link-up at Sovetsky on November 23rd was reenacted for Soviet propaganda cameras several days after it happened, because no cameraman was present at the actual moment. The reenacted version, orderly, lit, cinematically legible, the two groups of soldiers meeting in an open field with proper recognition signals, has appeared in documentary films about Stalingrad continuously for over 80 years. The actual link-up, as I've described earlier in this account, nearly ended in a friendly fire incident when the recognition flares failed, with vehicles from the two converging forces exchanging fire and damaging several tanks before identification was confirmed. The staged version has been shown more times than can be counted. The real version has no footage. This substitution, the clean, dramatic reenactment standing in for the confused, frigid, nearly disastrous reality, runs through the entire story of Uranus as a kind of structural truth about how the event has been transmitted to us. The archive contains both versions. Popular history has chosen the filmed one. What I want to say, as this account reaches its end, is something about the specific obligation that a subject of this scale imposes on whoever undertakes to describe it. The Soviet communiqué's 800,000 figure, total Axis losses in the full Stalingrad counteroffensive, is a number that can be processed as a statistic, and it's processed that way because there is no other cognitive mechanism available for numbers of that size. What the number represents is not abstract. It's the sum of an enormous number of individual instances of the thing the communiqué calls losses, each of which was, from the inside, something entirely other than a loss. The letter from the German mother to the Red Cross is one data point in that sum. The 47-word letter in the collection that said the guns are on all sides is another. The hand-drawn map of the cellar, showing the distance from the garden wall in meters, is another. The supply ledger with the marginal notation, "The Germans gave nothing," is another. The October 12th intelligence assessment that found the Soviet buildup and drew the wrong conclusion from it is another. None of these documents is the story. All of them together are closer to it than any single narrative can be. The relationship between the Stalingrad campaign and the present, the way the battle lives in current political discourse, the way its imagery and vocabulary are deployed in contemporary Russian state rhetoric about encirclement, sacrifice, and existential struggle, is not a historical abstraction. It's an active political fact. Understanding what Uranus actually was, the specific operational decisions, the supply ledger marginalia, the fake reenacted newsreel, the 48-kilometer gap at the Mishkova, the 91,000 prisoners and the 84,000 who died in captivity, is not an act of pedantry directed against more comfortable, simplified accounts. It's the minimum condition for using the history honestly. The propaganda version of Stalingrad has been doing work in the world for over 80 years. The documented version is messier, more complicated, and less cinematically available. It's also, insofar as the archive allows us to determine such things, closer to what happened. There's a specific question I've been circling throughout this account without fully landing on, and I want to name it directly here at the end. The question is what we owe to the accuracy of historical memory about events of this scale, and who bears the cost when we prefer the reenactment to the reality. The reenacted link-up at Sovetsky is a small example of a much larger pattern: the systematic substitution of the legible version of events for the documented one, driven by the requirements of narrative and the limits of available evidence and the pressures of institutional memory management. Every account of Uranus, including this one, involves selections and emphases that shape what the listener receives. The honest thing is to say so, and to say that the selections in this account have been aimed, consistently, at the specific and documented rather than the general and atmospheric, and that where the record is incomplete, that incompleteness has been named rather than papered over. Whether that aim has been fully achieved is a judgment I'm not positioned to make about my own work. What I can say is that the aim was genuine, and that the subject demanded it.